Welcome to 1% Club YouTube channel. We are explaining book summaries to add value and save the valuable time of your precious life. Before we start, make sure to subscribe to our channel for long book summaries with complete information from the book. Part 1. The Cognitive Revolution. The introduction of Sapiens is titled An Animal of No Significance, and it sets the stage for the entire book by challenging the reader to reconsider everything they think they know about the human species. Harari opens with a startling provocation. For the first 2.5 million years of human existence, our ancestors were not the dominant species on the planet. They were marginal creatures, living in fear of predators, competing with other large animals for food, and leaving behind only crude stone tools as evidence of their existence. The idea that humans are the pinnacle of evolution, the inevitable endpoint of a long and noble process, is not a scientific fact, but a narrative we tell ourselves. Harari introduces the concept of the human family tree, noting that for most of our history, multiple human species coexisted on Earth. Homo sapiens, our own species, shared the planet with Homo neanderthalensis in Europe, Homo erectus in Asia, Homo floresiensis on the Indonesian island of Flores, and Homo denisova in the mountains of Siberia, among others. These were not primitive versions of us, but distinct species, each with their own adaptations, their own behaviors, and their own ways of being human. The fact that we are the only human species left on the planet is not evidence of our inevitable triumph, but of a violent, competitive history in which we outcompeted, assimilated, or exterminated our closest relatives. Harari then poses the central question that drives the entire book. What made Homo sapiens, this unremarkable African ape, capable of colonizing the entire planet, creating complex societies, building empires, developing science, and ultimately becoming the most destructive force in the history of life on Earth? The answer, he argues, lies not in our bodies, which are relatively weak and unimpressive compared to other large animals, nor in our individual intelligence, which is not dramatically different from that of elephants or dolphins, but in our unique ability to cooperate flexibly in large numbers. The secret to our success, Harari writes, is that we are the only animal that can believe in things that do not exist. Gods, nations, laws, money, human rights, corporations. These are all fictions, shared myths that exist only in our collective imagination. But these fictions have allowed us to cooperate with complete strangers, to organize ourselves into armies and governments and economic systems, and to adapt to almost any environment on Earth. An ant colony can cooperate in huge numbers, but ants cooperate only with close relatives and in rigid, genetically programmed ways. A wolf pack can cooperate flexibly, but only among a handful of individuals who know each other personally. Homo sapiens alone can cooperate in large numbers with individuals we have never met, because we share a common belief in the same imagined realities. The introduction outlines the book's structure, which is divided into 4 parts that trace the major revolutions in human history. The Cognitive Revolution, which occurred around 70,000 years ago when Homo sapiens developed the linguistic and cognitive abilities that enabled them to create and share fictions, allowing them to organize and expand out of Africa and across the world. The Agricultural Revolution, which began around 12,000 years ago when humans began to domesticate plants and animals, abandoning the nomadic lifestyle of hunter-gatherers for the settled life of farmers, a change that Harari argues was not the leap forward it is often portrayed as, but a trap that made most humans more miserable and less healthy than their foraging ancestors. The unification of humankind, which traces the gradual integration of human societies into a single global system through the forces of money, empire, and religion. And the scientific revolution, which began around 500 years ago and continues to this day, when humans discovered that they could admit their ignorance, acquire new knowledge through observation and experimentation, and use that knowledge to transform the world and themselves. Harari ends the introduction with a warning. The revolutions that have made us the masters of the planet have also brought us to the brink of a crisis. Our ability to reshape the world has outstripped our ability to understand the consequences. We are more powerful than ever, but we are not necessarily wiser. The future of the human species, and of all life on Earth, depends on the choices we make in the coming decades and centuries. The introduction closes with an invitation to the reader not to accept Harari's conclusions uncritically, but to join him in asking the fundamental question. What do we want to become? The answer is not yet written. The story of Sapiens is still unfolding. Chapter 1 opens by taking the reader on a journey through the vast and complex family tree of the genus Homo, a group that includes not only our own species, Homo sapiens, but also several other human species that have since gone extinct. Harari begins by explaining that for millions of years, humans were not the apex predators or the dominant life form on Earth. They were small, vulnerable creatures living in fear of large carnivores such as saber-toothed cats, lions, and hyenas. The few stone tools that survive from this era suggest that early humans scavenged for meat left behind by more powerful animals, cracking open bones to extract marrow, a nutrient-rich food source that required no hunting skill. These early humans, including species such as Homo habilis and Homo rudolfensis, lived in small bands, likely numbering no more than a few dozen individuals, and their lives were governed by the same ecological pressures that shaped the lives of baboons, elephants, and other large mammals. Harari emphasizes that there was nothing inevitable about the rise of Homo sapiens. For 2.5 million years, the human family tree produced a variety of species, each adapted to specific environments, and none of them showed any clear sign of becoming the masters of the planet. The chapter then introduces the concept of the human family tree as a tangled bush rather than a straight line of descent from primitive to advanced. Harari explains that for most of human history, multiple human species coexisted on Earth at the same time. Homo neanderthalensis, the Neanderthals, were adapted to the cold climates of Ice Age Europe and Western Asia. They were stocky, muscular, and had larger brains than Homo sapiens. They used tools, controlled fire, hunted large game, and even buried their dead with what archaeologists interpret as ritual objects. Homo erectus, the longest-lasting human species, survived for nearly 2 million years in Asia, from the shores of Indonesia to the steppes of China. Homo floresiensis, discovered on the island of Flores in Indonesia, was a dwarf species, no more than 3 feet tall, that hunted pygmy elephants and lived in isolation until as recently as 12,000 years ago. Homo denisova, known only from a few bone fragments found in a Siberian cave, interbred with both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, leaving traces of its DNA in modern human populations. The diversity of these human species, Harari argues, challenges the common assumption that there is a single natural form of human, the one that exists today, and that all other forms were primitive stepping stones on the path to us. In reality, we are just one branch on a very large bush, and we are the last surviving branch. Harari then turns to the question of what makes Homo sapiens unique. He rejects the traditional answer that tool use or tool making is the defining characteristic of humanity, because chimpanzees and other animals also use tools. He also rejects the idea that language alone is unique, because many animals have complex communication systems. Instead, he argues that the key difference is the ability to share and believe in fictions. a concept that is introduced in the introduction and developed further in this chapter. Other animals communicate about real things, about food, danger, and social relationships. Humans communicate about things that do not exist at all, about gods and spirits, about nations and laws, about money and corporations. This ability to talk about fictions, Harari writes, is what made large-scale, flexible cooperation possible. A chimpanzee troop can cooperate only with individuals that each member knows personally, and only in ways that are dictated by instinct and immediate need. But thousands of ancient Egyptians could cooperate to build a pyramid because they all believed in the fiction of a pharaoh who was also a god. Millions of modern citizens can cooperate to support a social welfare system because they all believe in the fiction of a nation, a shared identity that exists only in their collective imagination. This ability to cooperate flexibly in huge numbers, Harari argues, is the secret weapon that allowed Homo sapiens to overcome their physical weaknesses and eventually dominate the planet. The chapter closes with a discussion of the cognitive revolution, the period around 70,000 years ago when, according to Harari, the linguistic and cognitive abilities of Homo sapiens underwent a dramatic transformation. The evidence for this revolution is indirect but compelling. Before 70,000 years ago, Homo sapiens were not significantly different from Neanderthals or Homo erectus. They used simple stone tools, lived in small bands, and had little impact on their environments. After 70,000 years ago, however, their behavior changed rapidly and dramatically. They began to produce more sophisticated tools, to trade over long distances, to create art and jewelry, to develop complex social structures, and to expand out of Africa into new territories. The cognitive revolution, Harari suggests, may have been caused by a genetic mutation that rewired the brains of Homo sapiens, giving them the ability to think and communicate in new ways. We do not know exactly what happened, and we may never know, but the consequences are undeniable. The cognitive revolution transformed Homo sapiens from an animal of no significance into a species capable of imagining and building entirely new worlds. The chapter ends with Harari's provocative claim that everything that makes humans special, our history, our culture, our science, our art, our wars, our loves, is built on the foundation of the shared ability to believe in fictions. We are not the children of the gods. We are the children of the stories we tell ourselves. Chapter 2, The Tree of Knowledge, dives deeply into the heart of Harari's central thesis about the cognitive revolution and its transformative impact on Homo sapiens. The chapter begins by challenging a common misconception about the relationship between language and human cooperation. Many animals have elaborate communication systems. Green monkeys use different alarm calls to warn their troop about snakes, eagles, or leopards, each call triggering a distinct evasive behavior. Bees perform a complex waggle dance to inform their hive about the location, distance, and quality of a food source. These are real, factual communications about the immediate, tangible world. Harari argues that the unique feature of human language is not its ability to describe reality, but its ability to discuss things that do not exist at all, to invent, to gossip, and to tell stories. The most important evolutionary development of the cognitive revolution was the emergence of what Harari calls fictions, shared myths that have no physical existence, but that can bind together large numbers of individuals who have never met. The tree of knowledge is not a literal tree of biological classification, but a metaphorical tree of shared stories, beliefs, and imagined orders that form the foundation of human society. Harari introduces the concept of gossip as a crucial evolutionary adaptation. Primatologists have long observed that monkeys and apes use grooming to maintain social bonds, to form alliances, and to navigate the complex politics of their troops. Grooming is time-consuming, however, and the size of a primate troop is limited by the amount of time individuals can dedicate to grooming relationships. For early humans, language provided a more efficient tool for social bonding. Instead of spending hours picking fleas off a fellow troop member, humans could exchange information about who was trustworthy, who was a liar, who was a good hunter, and who was secretly sleeping with whom. Gossip, Harari argues, allowed early human bands to grow larger and more cohesive, because individuals could learn about the reputations and behaviors of others without direct observation. A band that could share reliable gossip was better equipped to avoid freeloaders, punish cheaters, and reward cooperators. This was the first step in the development of large-scale cooperation, the ability to trust and coordinate with individuals beyond the limits of personal acquaintance. But gossip alone, Harari continues, could only take humans so far. The maximum size of a gossip-based community is still limited, typically around 150 individuals, a number known in anthropology as Dunbar's number. Beyond that threshold, humans cannot keep track of everyone's reputation through gossip alone. Something more powerful was needed to unite larger groups. He insists that something was the ability to believe in shared fictions. Harari gives the example of Peugeot, the French automobile company. Peugeot is not the cars themselves, the factories or the employees, all of which can be destroyed or replaced. Peugeot is a legal fiction, an imagined entity that exists only in the collective belief of lawyers, judges, and shareholders. Yet this fiction allows millions of people to cooperate, to produce cars, to trade shares, and to generate wealth. The same principle applies to nations, which are not natural features of the landscape but imagined communities of people who will never meet but who believe they share a common history, culture, and destiny. It applies to money, which has no intrinsic value but is accepted in exchange because everyone believes that everyone else will accept it. It applies to human rights, which do not exist in biology or physics but are treated as inviolable truths because enough people believe in them. Harari then explores the implications of shared fictions for human behavior and social organization. Unlike the laws of physics, which are universal and unchanging, imagined orders are contingent and flexible. They can be created, modified, and even destroyed by changing beliefs. This flexibility is both a strength and a weakness. It allows human societies to adapt rapidly to new environments and challenges, but it also makes them vulnerable to crisis when shared beliefs collapse. Harari uses the example of the French Revolution, which overthrew the imagined order of divine right monarchy and replaced it with the imagined order of popular sovereignty, citizenship, and human rights. Neither order was more real than the other, but the change in belief had profound, often violent, consequences for millions of people. The tree of knowledge, therefore, is not a tree of objective truths, but a tree of contingent stories. Shaudi Saldaris. So what we call knowledge is often just the shared fiction that enough people are willing to accept. The chapter also addresses the relationship between shared fictions and biological reality. Harari is careful to distinguish between claims that are biologically false and those that are culturally constructed. The idea that Africans are less intelligent than Europeans is a fiction, but it is also a falsehood that has been used to justify slavery, colonialism, and apartheid. The idea that the United States is a nation with a founding document and a set of laws is a fiction, but it is a useful fiction that allows millions of people to cooperate peacefully. The difference, Harari argues, is not in the reality of the fiction, but in its consequences. Some fictions promote cooperation and flourishing, while others promote exploitation and suffering. The task of the historian and of the thoughtful citizen is to examine the fictions we live by, to understand their origins and effects, and to ask whether they serve the interests of humanity or only the interests of the powerful. Harari then turns to the evolutionary consequences of the cognitive revolution. He argues that the ability to create and share fictions did not just change human behavior, it changed human biology. The social structures enabled by shared myths allowed humans to outcompete other species, to expand into new territories, and to increase their numbers dramatically. This success, in turn, created selective pressure for better cognitive abilities, for greater creativity, for more flexible language. The tree of knowledge was not a single event but a feedback loop, a self-reinforcing cycle in which new fictions enabled new forms of cooperation, which enabled new technologies, which enabled further expansion, which required new fictions to manage larger and more complex societies. This is why, Harari suggests, the cognitive revolution marks the beginning of history properly understood. Before it, humans were biological organisms subject to the same evolutionary pressures as any other animal. After it, humans became cultural organisms, shaped more by their stories than by their genes. The chapter closes with a discussion of the first, most fundamental shared fiction that emerged from the cognitive revolution, the ability to believe in the existence of spirits, gods, and supernatural forces. Harari argues that animism, the belief that animals, plants, and natural features possess spirits, was likely the earliest form of human religion. It allowed hunter-gatherer bands to cooperate with the natural world to negotiate with prey animals, to explain illness and misfortune, and to create rituals that reinforced social bonds. Unlike later religions, animism did not require belief in a single supreme being or in a clear hierarchy between humans and nature. It was a decentralized, flexible system of stories that could adapt to local conditions. The cognitive revolution, therefore, did not just give humans the ability to invent gods. It gave them the ability to invent anything. The tree of knowledge is infinite. The only limit is the human imagination. The chapter ends with Harari's observation that the same cognitive ability that allowed our ancestors to believe in spirits and totems now allows us to believe in nations, corporations, and human rights. We have not left the tree of knowledge behind. We have simply added new branches. The fictions change, but the need for fictions does not. Sapiens is, and always will be, the animal that lives by stories. Chapter 3, A Day in the Life of Adam and Eve, shifts the focus from the cognitive breakthroughs of early Homo sapiens to the actual lived experience of our foraging ancestors. Harari begins by acknowledging a fundamental challenge for anyone trying to understand the lives of ancient hunter-gatherers. They left behind almost no material record. Stone tools, a few scattered bones, and some cave paintings are all that survive. The rest, their social structures, their beliefs, their languages, their daily routines, their joys and sorrows have vanished completely. We cannot excavate a hunter-gatherer village because hunter-gatherers did not build villages. We cannot read their writings because they had no writing. We cannot interview them because they have been dead for tens of thousands of years. Harari argues that the common image of prehistoric life as nasty, brutish, and short owes more to modern assumptions than to actual evidence. Thomas Hobbes, the 17th century philosopher who coined that famous phrase, had never met a hunter-gatherer. He was imagining what life might be like without the institutions of European civilization. The reality, Harari suggests, was far more complex, and it, in many ways, more enviable than we assume. To reconstruct the world of our foraging ancestors, Harari draws on three sources of evidence. The first is archaeological, the physical remains of tools, hearths, and sometimes human footprints preserved in ancient mud. The second is ethnographic, the study of modern hunter-gatherer societies, such as the San people of the Kalahari Desert, and the Aboriginal peoples of Australia, who lived as foragers until recently. The third is evolutionary biology, The understanding that the bodies and minds of modern humans are adapted to the conditions of the Paleolithic era, not to the conditions of agriculture or industry. Harari cautions that no modern hunter-gatherer society is a perfect living fossil. They have all been influenced by contact with agricultural and industrial societies, often in devastating ways. But they offer the best available window into the range of human possibilities before the agricultural revolution. With these tools, Harari attempts to paint a picture of what a typical day might have looked like for a band of Homo sapiens living in East Africa around 30,000 years before the present. The chapter then describes the daily rhythms of foraging life. A hunter-gatherer band typically numbered between 20 and 50 individuals, large enough to cooperate effectively, small enough to move easily. They did not live in one place for long. They followed the seasons, the migrations of animals, and the ripening of wild plants. Their material possessions were few and portable, a few stone tools, some woven baskets, perhaps a set of fire-starting implements. They carried their infants and toddlers on their hips or backs, and older children walked alongside, learning by watching and imitating. The division of labor was not rigid. Men did most of the large game hunting, but women sometimes hunted too. Women did most of the gathering of plant foods, but men gathered as well. The distinction between work and leisure was blurred. A few hours of hunting or gathering each day was usually enough to meet the band's needs. The rest of the time was spent in social activities, talking, playing, grooming, telling stories, repairing tools, and resting. Foraging, Harari argues, was not a desperate struggle for survival. It was a sustainable, often comfortable way of life, one that left plenty of time for leisure and social bonding. Harari then addresses the question of diet and nutrition. The popular image of prehistoric humans as constantly hungry is misleading. Foragers had access to a wide variety of foods, hundreds of different species of plants and animals, depending on their environment. Their diets were diverse, nutrient-rich, and varied seasonally. They consumed more protein, more fiber, more vitamins, and less sugar, less fat, and less salt than modern agricultural or industrial diets. Harari points to the health of modern hunter-gatherers studied by anthropologists. They are taller, stronger, and less prone to the chronic diseases of affluence, heart disease, diabetes, obesity, hypertension than populations that have adopted farming or industrial diets. The skeletons of ancient foragers show that they suffered from few of the degenerative joint diseases and dental problems that plagued early farmers. They did suffer from infections, accidents, and the risks of childbirth, but on balance, Harari suggests, the foraging diet was superior to anything that came after. The agricultural revolution, far from improving human nutrition, actually made it worse, at least for the first several thousand years. The chapter also explores the social and emotional lives of foragers. Harari argues that the cognitive and linguistic abilities that emerged during the cognitive revolution were not just tools for survival, they were the foundation of rich inner lives. Foragers told stories, sang songs, danced, decorated their bodies, and created art. The cave paintings at Lascaux and Altamira, the carved figurines of the Venus of Willendorf, the flutes carved from bird bones, all testify to a species that was not merely concerned with food and shelter, but with meaning, beauty, and transcendence. Foragers likely practiced animism, the belief that animals, plants, rocks, and even weather phenomena possess spirits or personalities. They did not see themselves as separate from or superior to the natural world, but as participants in a web of relationships that included all living things. This worldview, Harari suggests, fostered a sense of belonging and responsibility that may have been lost as humans learned to domesticate plants and animals. The foragers' world was not a paradise. There were dangers, conflicts, and hardships. But it was a world in which humans were deeply embedded in their environment, not alienated from it. Harari then confronts the question of violence and warfare among foragers. The evidence is ambiguous. Some modern hunter-gatherer societies, such as the San, have low rates of violence and have been observed to resolve conflicts through ritualized fighting or social shaming rather than lethal force. Others, such as the Yanomami of the Amazon, have high rates of interband violence, with a significant percentage of adult males dying in conflicts over women, territory, or honor. Archaeological evidence from the Paleolithic era is sparse, but there are sites that suggest occasional violent clashes between groups. Harari concludes that there is no single answer. Human behavior is flexible. Foragers were capable of both peaceful cooperation and brutal violence, depending on circumstances. What is clear is that the scale of violence was much smaller than the violence that came with agriculture and civilization. A foraging band of 40 people could fight with another band of 40, but they could not kill millions in a world war or a genocide. The technologies of violence, like everything else, were limited by the foraging lifestyle. The chapter closes with a reflection on the evolutionary mismatch between our bodies and our modern lives. Harari argues that we are Paleolithic minds living in a technological world. Our brains and bodies were shaped by the conditions of foraging, by long walks in search of food, by bursts of intense activity followed by rest, by social interactions in small, intimate groups, by diverse and unprocessed diets. These conditions no longer exist for most of humanity. We sit in chairs for hours. We eat processed foods high in sugar and fat. We interact with strangers through screens. We experience chronic stress from artificial deadlines and social pressures. The result is an epidemic of anxiety, depression, obesity, and chronic disease. Harari is not advocating a return to foraging. That is impossible and undesirable for most of the world's population. But he suggests that understanding the gap between our evolutionary heritage and our modern environment might help us design healthier lives. A Day in the Life of Adam and Eve is not a nostalgic portrait of a lost golden age. It is an invitation to recognize that the way we live now is not the only way to live, and that the adaptations that made our ancestors successful are still operating within us, often at odds with the world we have built. The chapter ends with Harari's observation that we are not prisoners of our biology, but we are not free from it either. The foragers are not dead. They are us, beneath the layers of civilization, waiting to be understood. Chapter 4, The Flood, marks a dramatic turning point in the story of Homo sapiens, shifting from the internal cognitive developments of the species to its external impact on the rest of the planet. Harari begins by posing a stark question. Why did Homo sapiens, having emerged as a relatively insignificant African ape, manage within a few tens of thousands of years to spread across every continent and become the most widespread large mammal on Earth? The answer, he argues, lies not in a single cause, but in a combination of factors. The cognitive revolution gave sapiens the ability to cooperate flexibly in large numbers. This ability allowed them to organize hunting expeditions, to coordinate migrations, and to adapt their behavior to new environments more rapidly than any other species. But the cognitive revolution alone was not enough. Something else was needed to drive sapiens out of Africa and across the globe. That something was ecological destruction. Wherever Homo sapiens went, Harari writes, the native large animals of that region soon began to disappear. The flood, in this context, is not a biblical deluge, but a metaphor for the wave of extinctions that followed in the wake of the human expansion. Harari then takes the reader on a journey across the world, chronicling the arrival of Homo sapiens in each new territory and the subsequent collapse of local megafauna populations. The first wave of extinction occurred in Australia, which was colonized by sapiens around 45,000 years ago. At that time, Australia was home to a stunning array of giant animals: marsupial lions the size of leopards, diprotodons the size of rhinoceroses, giant kangaroos that stood 10 feet tall, and the monstrous lizard Megalania, which could grow to over 20 feet in length. Within a few thousand years of the arrival of humans, nearly all of these giant creatures were extinct. Of the Australian megafauna, only the kangaroo and the wombat survive today. Harari acknowledges that climate change also played a role in these extinctions, as the Ice Age was ending and the climate was becoming warmer and drier. But he argues that climate change alone cannot explain the timing or the severity of the die-off. Australia had experienced previous climate shifts without mass extinctions. The arrival of humans was the new variable. Sapiens were skilled hunters, and they had a technological advantage that native Australian animals had never encountered. They used fire to reshape the landscape, burning forests to create grasslands that favored the animals they preferred to hunt. They targeted the largest, slowest breeding animals first, those that were easiest to kill and provided the most meat. Once those populations collapsed, the ecosystem could not recover. The chapter then moves to the colonization of the Americas, which occurred much later, around 16,000 years ago. The Americas had been isolated from the rest of the world for millions of years, and their fauna had evolved in the absence of human hunters. When sapiens crossed the Bering Land Bridge from Siberia into Alaska, they entered a continent populated by an astonishing diversity of giant creatures: saber-toothed cats, giant ground sloths, mammoths, mastodons, glyptodonts the size of Volkswagens, beavers the size of bears, and horses, camels, and lions that were native to the Americas but would later go extinct there, surviving only in the Old World. Within 2,000 years of human arrival, roughly 35 genera of large American mammals were extinct, representing about 72% of the continent's megafauna. The timing is striking. The extinctions followed the southward spread of human hunters, occurring first in North America, then in Central America, and finally in South America. Once again, Harari acknowledges the complicating factor of climate change. The Ice Age was ending, and the warming climate placed stress on many species. But again, he argues that climate change alone cannot explain the pattern. The American megafauna had survived previous interglacial periods. The only new factor was the arrival of a highly intelligent, highly adaptable, and highly destructive predator. Harari then turns to the extinction of other human species, an event that is often overlooked in discussions of the sapiens expansion. When Homo sapiens left Africa, they did not enter an empty world. Eurasia was already inhabited by Neanderthals, who had adapted to cold climates for hundreds of thousands of years. Asia was home to Homo erectus, the longest-lasting human species. Indonesia had the tiny Homo floresiensis. Siberia held the Denisovans. Over the course of their global expansion, sapiens encountered these other humans, and within a relatively short time, all of them disappeared. The last Neanderthals died out around 30,000 years ago, roughly 10,000 years after sapiens arrived in Europe. The other species vanished even earlier. Harari discusses 3 theories about what happened. The first is interbreeding. Perhaps sapiens and Neanderthals mated, and the Neanderthal lineage was absorbed into the larger sapiens population rather than exterminated. Genetic evidence supports some interbreeding, as modern non-African human populations carry between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA. The second theory is genocide. Perhaps sapiens actively hunted and killed their rivals, using their superior numbers, weapons, and social organization to wage war on other human species. The third theory is competitive displacement. Perhaps sapiens did not need to kill Neanderthals directly, they simply outcompeted them for resources, using more efficient hunting techniques, more flexible social structures, and larger populations to gradually push Neanderthals into marginal habitats where they could not survive. Harari suggests that all three processes likely occurred to some degree, but the genetic evidence of interbreeding is relatively low, suggesting that replacement, rather than absorption, was the dominant outcome. The Neanderthals are gone. We are their successors, not their descendants. The chapter then explores the consequences of this wave of extinctions for the ecosystems that sapiens colonized. Harari argues that the loss of megafauna had cascading effects on vegetation, on smaller animal populations, and on the overall functioning of these environments. The giant herbivores of Australia and the Americas had been keystone species, shaping the landscape through their grazing and browsing. When they disappeared, plant communities changed, fire regimes altered, and the entire ecosystem shifted to a new state. These changes, in turn, made the environment more vulnerable to further human modification, including the intentional use of fire to clear land. By the time the first farmers emerged, Harari writes, sapiens had already transformed the planet in profound ways. The flood was not a single event, but a process, a wave of ecological change that followed the expansion of a single species across the globe. We are living in the aftermath of that wave, in a world that has been shaped by human action for tens of thousands of years. The idea of pristine nature, of wilderness untouched by human hands, is largely a myth. By the time Europeans arrived in the Americas, the continents had already been inhabited by humans for millennia. The forests, the grasslands, the animal populations, all had been influenced by human hunting, burning, and settlement. Harari ends the chapter with a sobering reflection on the relationship between Homo sapiens and the rest of the natural world. He writes that the extinctions of the Australian and American megafauna are not isolated events, but part of a pattern that has continued to the present day. Wherever humans go, large animals die. The passenger pigeon, the dodo, the great auk, the Steller's sea cow, the thylacine, countless species have been driven to extinction by hunting, habitat destruction, and the introduction of invasive species. The flood has not stopped. It has only accelerated. Harari does not present this as a moral indictment of humanity, at least not directly. He is a historian, not a preacher. But he asks the reader to consider the implications. We are not the innocent stewards of the earth, living in harmony with nature that some romantic narratives suggest. We are a species of unprecedented destructive power, and we have been using that power for tens of thousands of years. The difference between a Paleolithic hunter and a modern industrial farmer is one of scale, not of kind. Both transform their environments to suit their needs. Both kill other species to survive. The only difference is that we are now so numerous, so technologically powerful, and so globally interconnected that our impact is orders of magnitude greater than anything our ancestors could have imagined. The chapter closes with Harari's observation that the story of sapiens is not just a story of triumph. It is also a story of loss. The animals we have lost, the ecosystems we have altered, the other human species we have replaced, they are not coming back. The flood has receded, but the world it left behind is not the same world that existed before the waters rose. We are the flood, and we are still rising. Part 2. The Agricultural Revolution. Chapter 5, History's Biggest Fraud, delivers one of the most provocative and widely discussed arguments in Sapiens. Harari contends that the agricultural revolution, long celebrated as a great leap forward for humanity, was in fact a catastrophic mistake, a trap that made the majority of humans more miserable, less healthy, and less free than their foraging ancestors. The chapter opens with a vivid description of what the transition to agriculture actually looked like. It did not happen overnight. It was not a single moment of discovery or invention. It was a gradual, haphazard process that unfolded over thousands of years, in different places and at different times, involving different species of plants and animals. Around 9,500 BCE, in the hills of southeastern Turkey, western Iran, and the Levant, hunter-gatherer bands began to devote more time and energy to cultivating wild wheat and barley. They cleared away competing plants, scattered seeds in prepared soil, and returned to the same patches of land year after year. Over time, they selected seeds from the most productive plants, inadvertently breeding strains that were larger, more stable, and easier to harvest. The plants, in a sense, domesticated the humans as much as the humans domesticated the plants. Wheat, which had been a wild grass of no particular significance, became one of the most successful species on Earth, spreading across continents and dominating vast landscapes. But what did wheat gain from this arrangement? It gained survival and reproduction on an enormous scale. What did humans gain? Harari argues that they gained a lifestyle that was harder, less healthy, and less secure than the foraging life they had left behind. Harari then systematically dismantles the common narrative that agriculture provided a more reliable food supply. Hunter-gatherers, he notes, had a diverse diet of hundreds of species of plants and animals. If one food source failed, they could turn to another. They stored little surplus, but they also had little need for surplus, because they could move to where food was abundant. Farmers, by contrast, relied on a small number of domesticated crops, often just one or two staple grains. If the harvest failed, if the rains did not come, if pests devoured the fields, the entire community faced starvation. The evidence from ancient skeletons is stark. The first farmers were shorter, had more dental cavities, more bone deformities, and more signs of nutritional deficiency than their foraging predecessors. They also suffered from new diseases that flourished in dense, settled populations: tuberculosis, leprosy, cholera, smallpox. The concentration of people and domesticated animals created ideal conditions for the evolution of infectious pathogens. The farmer's diet was less diverse and less nutritious than the forager's diet. The farmer's workload was heavier and more monotonous. The farmer's social life was more constrained, tied to the fields and the village, less mobile and less varied. The chapter then explores the political and social consequences of agriculture. Foraging bands were small, egalitarian, and mobile. Leaders had limited authority because followers could simply leave if they were dissatisfied. Property was minimal, and ownership was fluid. The agricultural revolution changed all of this. Farming required investment, cleared fields, irrigation canals, stored seed, domesticated animals. These investments tied people to their land. They could not simply pack up and leave if a leader became oppressive. They had to defend their fields and stores from raiders, which required walls, guards, and eventually armies. Surplus food allowed some individuals to specialize in activities other than food production, giving rise to priests, scribes, soldiers, artisans, and administrators. These specialists, in turn, created hierarchies and power structures that had never existed before. The egalitarian bands of foragers gave way to stratified societies of peasants, nobles, and kings. Harari argues that this was not a conscious choice. No group of hunter-gatherers sat down and voted to become farmers. The transition happened gradually, decision by decision, generation by generation, each step seeming like a reasonable improvement at the time. But the cumulative effect was a loss of freedom, health, and well-being on a scale that is difficult to overstate. Harari introduces the concept of the luxury trap to explain this paradox. He uses the example of a young forager who decides to settle down and plant a few wild grains. At first, this seems like a smart move. He has a reliable source of food near his camp. He does not have to wander as far to find edible plants. His life becomes slightly easier, but the seeds he plants, require him to stay nearby to weed and water and guard the field. He cannot wander as freely as before. The next season, he plants more seeds, because the first planting worked well. He builds a small storage hut to protect his surplus grain. Now he must guard the hut as well as the field. He has more work, but he also has more food, which allows him to have more children. More children require more food, which requires more planting. Within a few generations, his descendants are spending 10 hours a day bent over the soil, their bodies twisted by labor, their teeth rotted by a grain-heavy diet, their society divided into rich and poor rulers and subjects. No one planned this outcome, no one wanted it. But each small, rational decision led inexorably to a result that no one would have chosen. This, Harari writes, is the tragedy of the agricultural revolution. It was history's biggest fraud. Not because someone was deliberately deceiving humanity, but because humanity deceived itself, chasing small comforts into a trap of its own making. The chapter then addresses the question of why, if agriculture was such a disaster, did it spread so quickly and so widely? Harari offers two answers. The first is that agriculture, despite its costs, did allow for a dramatic increase in population density. A square mile of farmland can support many more people than a square mile of wild forest. Even if each individual farmer was worse off than each individual forager, the sheer number of farmers meant that agricultural societies could overwhelm or absorb foraging societies through numbers alone. The second answer is that once agriculture took hold in a region, it was nearly impossible for people to return to foraging. The population had grown too large to be supported by wild resources. The skills of foraging had been forgotten. The knowledge of wild plants and animals had been lost. The forest had been cleared. The game had been hunted to extinction in the local area. The farmers were trapped, not by an external enemy, but by their own demographic success. They had created a world that could no longer support them in any other way. Harari also challenges the idea that agriculture led to greater leisure and security. Studies of modern hunter-gatherers and traditional farmers show that foragers typically work fewer hours per day, enjoy more varied leisure activities, and have more egalitarian social structures than farmers. The farmer's life is one of unrelenting labor, from sunrise to sunset, from planting to harvest, from birth to death. The forager's life, by contrast, is punctuated by long periods of rest, storytelling, dancing, and socializing. The forager's security comes from mobility and diversity. The farmer's security depends on the success of a single crop in a single field. When the crop fails, the farmer starves. When the game is scarce, the forager moves to where the game is abundant. Harari acknowledges that this picture of foraging life is not uniformly idyllic. There were famines, conflicts, and hardships in the Paleolithic as well. But the evidence from archaeology, anthropology, and biology consistently suggests that the average forager was healthier, happier, and more secure than the average early farmer. The chapter closes with a reflection on the historical irony of the agricultural revolution. We have been taught to see it as a necessary step on the path to civilization, to writing, to science, to art, to all the achievements that we value. Harari does not deny that these achievements followed from agriculture. Without surplus food, there could be no specialists, no cities, no empires, no written records, no philosophical inquiry. But he asks whether the trade-off was worth it. Would a Paleolithic forager, transported to the present day, be grateful for the civilization that followed from the domestication of wheat? Or would she look at the crowded cities, the polluted skies, the endless labor, the anxiety of modern life, and wonder what we have done to ourselves? Harari does not answer this question. He leaves it for the reader to consider. But he insists that we cannot understand the agricultural revolution as a straightforward story of progress. It was a bargain, and like all bargains, it had a price. The price was the loss of the foraging way of life, a way of life that had sustained Homo sapiens for 200,000 years, that had shaped our bodies, our minds, and our societies. We are still living with the consequences of that bargain. The chapter ends with Harari's observation that history is not a story of improvement. It is a story of change, and change often brings loss as well as gain. The agricultural revolution was history's biggest fraud because it sold humanity a promise of ease and security and delivered toil, inequality, and disease. We have never fully escaped that transaction. We are the children of the farmers, and we carry their burdens with us still. Chapter 6, Building Pyramids, addresses a fundamental puzzle that arises from the agricultural revolution. If agriculture made the majority of people miserable, as Harari argued in the previous chapter, why did they not simply abandon their fields and return to foraging? The answer, he explains, lies in the realm of imagined orders, the shared fictions that emerged after the agricultural revolution to justify and maintain the new social structures. The chapter opens with the image of a pyramid, not just the physical pyramids of Egypt, but any large-scale human construction that requires the coordinated labor of thousands or millions of people. How did a few million ancient Egyptians come to cooperate so effectively that they could quarry, transport, and assemble millions of stone blocks, some weighing as much as 80 tons, into structures that have endured for over 4,000 years? The answer is not force alone, though force was certainly involved. The answer is a shared belief in a fiction, the divine authority of the pharaoh, the promise of an afterlife, the sacred duty of obedience. Without these fictions, the pyramid would have remained a pile of unmoved stone. Harari then introduces the concept of imagined orders as the foundation of all large-scale human cooperation. An imagined order is a network of shared myths that exists only in the collective imagination of the people who believe in it. It has no objective reality, no physical existence, but it shapes human behavior as powerfully as any physical force. The Code of Hammurabi, the legal system of ancient Babylon, was an imagined order. It divided society into three hierarchies: the elite, the commoners, and the slaves, and assigned different rights and punishments to each. There was nothing objectively true about this division. It was not written in the laws of physics or biology. But the people of Babylon believed in it, and that belief was real enough to shape their lives, their labor, their marriages, and their deaths. The American Declaration of Independence, Harari writes, is also an imagined order. It asserts that all men are created equal and endowed with certain unalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These claims are not objectively true in a scientific sense. Humans are not created equal in any biological measure. Some are stronger, faster, smarter, healthier than others. But the belief in equality is a powerful fiction that has shaped laws, revolutions, wars, and the lives of billions of people. The difference between Hammurabi and Jefferson is not that one was wrong and the other right. The difference is that they believed in different fictions, and different people were willing to kill and die for those fictions. The chapter then explores how imagined orders are sustained and transmitted across generations. Harari identifies three key mechanisms. The first is that imagined orders are embedded in the material world. The Egyptian pyramid is not just a building. It is a physical manifestation of the belief in the pharaoh's divinity. The medieval cathedral is not just a place of worship. It is a stone sermon, a visual argument for the reality of God and the authority of the church. The modern school, with its grades, diplomas, and standardized tests is a material embodiment of the belief that knowledge can be quantified and that some people are more educated and therefore more deserving of social status than others. These physical structures make the imagined order seem natural, inevitable, and permanent. The second mechanism is that imagined orders shape our desires. An ancient Egyptian noble did not dream of a modest home and a simple life. He dreamed of a grand tomb filled with treasures to accompany him to the afterlife. A modern consumer does not dream of living without possessions. She dreams of a larger house, a newer car, a more prestigious brand of clothing. The imagined order of consumer capitalism has shaped not only what we do but what we want. We pursue happiness through acquisition because we have been taught that happiness is found in things. The third mechanism is that imagined orders are embedded in our social relationships. We do not believe in money because we have studied economic theory. We believe in money because everyone around us believes in money. Our boss pays us in currency that we accept because we know the landlord will accept it for rent, the grocer will accept it for food, the bank will accept it for loans. The fiction is sustained by the network of interactions that depend on it. If everyone stopped believing in money tomorrow, the entire global economy would collapse. But no one does stop believing, because belief is reinforced by every transaction, every salary, every price tag. Harari then addresses the question of how imagined orders can survive, despite the obvious suffering and injustice they often produce. He argues that most imagined orders contain within them a promise of ultimate meaning or a reward that transcends the suffering of daily life. The Egyptian peasant, who spent his life hauling stones for the pharaoh's pyramid, was told that his labor would be rewarded in the afterlife, that his obedience would be remembered, that his suffering had cosmic significance. The medieval serf, who worked the Lord's land without pay, was told that his poverty was a virtue, that the rich would face divine judgment, that his patience would be rewarded in heaven. The modern factory worker who spends his days performing repetitive, mind-numbing tasks is told that he is contributing to the economy, that his labor creates value, that his suffering is a necessary part of progress. These stories do not eliminate suffering, but they make it bearable. They give suffering a meaning, and a meaningful suffering is easier to endure than a senseless one. The chapter also explores the relationship between imagined orders and the objective reality of human biology and psychology. Harari is careful to argue that not everything is a fiction. Hunger, pain, fear, love, joy, these are real biological experiences. A peasant who is starving is not suffering from a fiction. A soldier who is wounded in battle is not bleeding from a myth. The imagined orders overlay these biological realities, giving them context and meaning. The starving peasant might believe that his hunger is a test from the gods, that his suffering will be rewarded, that his children will have a better life. The wounded soldier might believe that his sacrifice is for his nation, that his courage will be remembered, that his death has meaning. The biological reality of suffering is universal. The meaning attached to that suffering varies across cultures and across time. The power of imagined orders lies in their ability to shape that meaning, to transform raw pain into noble sacrifice, to turn drudgery into devotion. The chapter closes with a reflection on the possibility of escaping imagined orders. Harari argues that no human has ever lived entirely outside of an imagined order. Even the most isolated hermit carries with him the language, the concepts, the assumptions of his culture. The foragers of the Paleolithic had their own imagined orders, animist beliefs, kinship structures, taboos, and rituals. The difference between a foraging band and a modern nation-state is not that one lives in reality and the other in fiction. It is that they live in different fictions, and the scale of those fictions has expanded dramatically. We cannot live without stories. We cannot cooperate in large numbers without shared beliefs. The task, Harari suggests, is not to escape imagined orders altogether, which is impossible, but to recognize them for what they are, to understand that the gods, the nations, the laws, the money, the rights that we take for granted are not eternal truths, but human creations. This recognition does not destroy these fictions. It does not make us stop believing in money or nations or human rights, but it might make us more humble, more critical, more open to changing the stories that no longer serve us. The chapter ends with Harari's observation that the pyramids of Egypt still stand, but the pharaohs who built them are gone. The imagined order that justified their labor has crumbled. The stones remain. The stories do not. We are building our own pyramids today, in the form of corporations, financial systems, legal codes, and international institutions. We believe that these structures are real, necessary, permanent. History suggests otherwise. The pyramids will fall, new pyramids will rise, and the builders will keep building, because building pyramids is what Sapiens does. It is our gift and our curse. Chapter 7. Memory overload addresses a critical problem that emerged as human societies grew larger and more complex following the agricultural revolution. As populations expanded from small foraging bands of a few dozen individuals to agricultural villages of hundreds, and eventually to cities and empires of tens of thousands or millions, the limitations of the human brain became a serious obstacle. The brain, Harari explains, is an extraordinary organ, but it has several inherent limitations that make it ill-suited for managing large-scale societies. First, the brain is finite. It can only store a limited amount of information. Second, the brain is mortal. When a person dies, the information stored in their brain dies with them, unless it has been transmitted to others. Third, and most critically, the human brain is not well adapted for storing and processing large volumes of numerical and administrative data. A forager needs to remember the location of water sources, the behavior of prey animals, the edibility of hundreds of plant species, and the social dynamics of a few dozen band members. This is challenging, but manageable. An administrator in an early empire needs to track grain reserves, tax payments, land ownership, military conscription, trade routes, and the lineages of thousands of individuals. This is impossible for any single human brain to manage reliably. The chapter then traces the history of information management, beginning with the limitations of purely oral cultures. In small-scale societies, knowledge could be transmitted through memory, storytelling, and ritual. The elders of a band could remember the important information and pass it down to the next generation through spoken words and repeated performances. This system worked for bands and villages of a few hundred people, but it began to break down as societies grew larger. The volume of information increased, the complexity of social relations multiplied, and the need for accurate, retrievable, and permanent records became acute. Harari gives the example of ancient Sumer, one of the first civilizations to develop a system of writing. The Sumerians needed to track the collection and distribution of grain, the payment of laborers, the ownership of land, and the rituals of their increasingly complex religion. They developed a system of script, first as pictographs and later as cuneiform, impressed into clay tablets with a stylus. The earliest Sumerian writing was not used for poetry, philosophy, or history. It was used for accounting. The first written word, Harari notes, was not God, or king, or love, or war. It was barley. Harari then explores the profound consequences of writing for human societies. Writing allowed information to be stored outside the human brain, in a form that could be retrieved, copied, checked, and transmitted across generations without loss or distortion. A clay tablet could record the amount of grain stored in a royal granary more accurately than any human memory. A legal code could be inscribed and displayed publicly, so that everyone could know the rules and no one could claim ignorance. A tax register could track the obligations of thousands of households, ensuring that the state could collect the revenue it needed to function. Writing made possible the large-scale, impersonal, and durable forms of cooperation that characterize complex civilizations. Without writing, there could be no empires, no bureaucracies, no legal systems, no long-distance trade networks, no organized religions with standardized doctrines. Writing did not replace human memory entirely. It supplemented it, extended it, and in many ways, transformed the very nature of what it meant to know something. The chapter then examines the limitations of early writing systems. Sumerian cuneiform, Egyptian hieroglyphs, and other early scripts were complex, requiring years of training to master. They were used by a small class of professional scribes who occupied a privileged position in society. The ability to read and write was a source of power, and scribes often became trusted advisors to kings and administrators of vast estates. Harari describes the training of a scribe as long, arduous, and highly disciplined, involving the memorization of hundreds of signs and the mastery of complex grammatical rules. This created a bottleneck. Information could be recorded, but it could only be accessed by a tiny elite. The masses remained illiterate, dependent on the scribes to interpret the written word for them. This dynamic persisted for thousands of years and shaped the development of law, religion, and government. The written law was not for everyone. It was for those who could read it, or for those who could afford to pay someone who could. Harari then introduces the concept of partial scripts, systems of notation that are not full writing but serve specialized functions. The most important example is the numeric script, the system of symbols for representing numbers. Early numeric scripts were used for accounting long before full writing emerged. They allowed administrators to track quantities without needing to record full sentences or narratives. Over time, numeric scripts were integrated with phonetic scripts to create the flexible, powerful writing systems that we use today. Harari emphasizes that the development of writing and the development of mathematics were deeply intertwined. The first mathematicians were not philosophers or physicists. They were accountants and tax collectors. The abstract concept of zero, one of the most important intellectual breakthroughs in human history, emerged from the practical need to represent the absence of a quantity in a column of numbers. The line between writing and mathematics is not as sharp as we might think. Both are technologies for storing and processing information outside the human brain. The chapter then turns to the cognitive impact of writing on human thought. Harari argues that writing does not just record information, it changes the way people think. Oral cultures tend to be fluid, adaptive, and context-dependent. A story told by an elder to a group of children around a fire can change with each telling, adapting to the audience, the occasion, and the storyteller's mood. Writing fixes information in a permanent form. A written text is stable. It can be compared across copies. It can be checked for consistency. It can be analyzed and criticized in ways that spoken words cannot. This stability allowed for the development of systematic thought, of logic, of law, of science. The ability to write down a proposition, to examine it slowly, to test it against other written propositions, to revise it and rewrite it, is the foundation of the intellectual disciplines that define modern civilization. But this stability also has a cost. Written texts can become rigid, dogmatic, and resistant to change. A sacred text written thousands of years ago can continue to shape the beliefs and behaviors of millions of people long after the conditions that produced it have disappeared. Writing gives us memory, but it also gives us tradition, and tradition is not always our friend. Harari closes the chapter with a reflection on the future of information management. He notes that we are living through another revolution in information technology, the digital revolution, which is transforming the way we store, process, and transmit information as profoundly as the invention of writing did. The human brain is no longer the primary repository of human knowledge. It has been supplemented and in many ways superseded by external information systems of staggering complexity. We carry in our pockets devices that can access the accumulated knowledge of our entire species, from the recipe for beer to the theory of relativity. This is a power that our ancestors could not have imagined, but it also comes with new challenges: information overload, the difficulty of distinguishing truth from falsehood, the concentration of information in the hands of a few powerful corporations, the erosion of privacy, the manipulation of belief through targeted messaging. The problem that writing solved, the problem of limited memory, has been replaced by a new problem: the problem of too much memory, too much information, too little wisdom. The chapter ends with Harari's observation that we have not yet learned to manage this new world. We are still, in many ways, as overwhelmed by the flood of information as the first Sumerian scribes were overwhelmed by the flood of grain that needed to be accounted for. The medium has changed. The challenge remains. And we are still building the pyramids, still scribbling on clay, still trying to remember what matters and forget what does not. Memory overload is not a problem we solved in the past. It is a condition of human existence. We will never be free of it. We can only learn to live with it, one tablet, one book, one byte at a time. Chapter 8, There is No Justice in History, confronts one of the most uncomfortable implications of the argument that human societies are built on imagined orders. If the hierarchies that structure our world, the distinctions between rich and poor, noble and commoner, master and slave, man and woman, are not natural or inevitable but human creations, then they can be changed. But they persist, often for thousands of years, because those who benefit from them work to maintain them, and because those who are harmed by them come to believe in their legitimacy. Harari opens the chapter by examining the Code of Hammurabi, the ancient Babylonian legal system that divided society into three hierarchical classes. The code was not presented as a human invention. It was presented as a divine commandment handed down by the gods to the king, to be enforced for the good of all. The elites who benefited from this system believed in it genuinely, or at least acted as if they did. The commoners and slaves also believed, or at least did not have the power or the imagination to conceive of an alternative. The code was unjust by any modern standard, but it was accepted as just by the people who lived under it. This is the power of an imagined order. It does not need to be true to be real. It only needs to be believed. Harari then introduces the concept of the vicious circle, the self-reinforcing mechanism by which imagined orders are maintained across generations. The circle begins with a set of beliefs about how society should be organized, about who deserves power and wealth, and who deserves subordination and poverty. These beliefs are embedded in the material world, in laws, in property rights, in educational systems, in architectural forms. A child born into a society with a rigid caste system does not encounter the system as a set of abstract ideas. She encounters it as the physical reality of her neighborhood, her school, her family, her opportunities. She learns from her parents, her teachers, her peers, and her environment that some people are naturally superior and others naturally inferior. By the time she is old enough to question these beliefs, they have become part of her identity, her sense of how the world works. She may never explicitly believe in the ideology of the hierarchy, but she will act in ways that reproduce it because she has internalized its categories. The vicious circle is not a conspiracy, though conspiracies certainly exist. It is a structure, a pattern of behavior and belief that reproduces itself without anyone having to plan it. Those who benefit from the hierarchy do not need to actively oppress those below them. They just need to keep the circle turning. The chapter then turns to the specific example of the Indian caste system, one of the most elaborate and enduring social hierarchies in human history. The caste system divided Indian society into thousands of hereditary groups, each with its own occupation, social status, and rules of interaction. At the top were the Brahmins, the priests, and scholars. Below them were the Kshatriyas, the warriors and rulers. Below them were the Vaishyas, the merchants and farmers. Below them were the Shudras, the laborers and servants. And below all of them were the untouchables, so called because their touch was believed to pollute members of higher castes. The system was justified by religious beliefs about purity and pollution, about the consequences of actions in past lives, about the cosmic order of the universe. A person born into a low caste was not seen as unlucky or oppressed. They were seen as paying the karmic debt for misdeeds in a previous life. Their suffering was just, deserved, and ultimately their own responsibility. This belief system was so powerful that even those at the bottom of the hierarchy often accepted its legitimacy. They did not rebel against the Brahmins. They tried to live virtuous lives in the hope of being born into a higher caste in the next incarnation. The circle held for over 2,000 years, until the modern era, when British colonial rule, urbanization, industrialization, and the reform movements of leaders like B.R. Ambedkar and Mahatma Gandhi began to challenge its foundations. Even today, the caste system is not gone. It has been officially abolished, but its influence persists in marriage patterns, social interactions, and political alignments. The imagined order of caste was not natural. It was created by humans, and it can be unmade by humans. But unmaking a fiction that has been believed for millennia is not easy. Harari then turns to the most pervasive and persistent social hierarchy in human history, the hierarchy of gender. He argues that the near-universal subordination of women to men is not a biological necessity, but a cultural construct, and that the justifications offered for it are remarkably varied and often contradictory. Different societies have justified male dominance in different ways. Some argue that men are stronger, so they should be the protectors and providers. Others argue that women are purer, more virtuous, or closer to the divine, so they should be sheltered from the corruptions of the public sphere. Others argue that women are irrational, emotional, and incapable of abstract thought, so they should be excluded from positions of power and authority. The common thread is not a consistent theory of male superiority, but the persistent outcome of male dominance. Harari surveys the evidence from biology and anthropology to assess the claim that gender hierarchy is inevitable. He notes that while there are biological differences between males and females, these differences are statistical averages, not absolute categories. There are women who are stronger than most men. There are men who are more nurturing than most women. The overlap between the sexes is far greater than the differences. Moreover, the specific forms that gender hierarchy takes vary enormously across cultures and across time. What it means to be a man or a woman is not the same in ancient Rome, medieval Japan, Victorian England, and contemporary Scandinavia. This variation suggests that gender is not a fixed biological destiny, but a social construction, an imagined order that can be reimagined. The chapter then explores several theories that have been offered to explain the origin of gender hierarchy. One theory points to physical strength, arguing that men used their greater upper body strength to dominate women in pre-agricultural societies. Harari notes that this theory is undermined by the fact that many foraging societies were relatively egalitarian, and that women in such societies often had significant autonomy and influence. Another theory points to childbearing, arguing that women's reproductive role made them more vulnerable and dependent on male protection. Harari counters that many female animals, including our closest primate relatives, are not universally subordinate to males, and that human societies have developed a wide range of arrangements for managing pregnancy and childcare. Another theory points to the division of labor, arguing that men specialized in hunting because of their physical advantages, while women specialized in gathering and childcare because of their reproductive role, and that this division eventually hardened into a rigid hierarchy. Harari finds this theory more plausible but still incomplete. The division of labor does not automatically lead to hierarchy. It could have led to mutual respect and equal partnership. The fact that it did not, and that male dominance became nearly universal, suggests that there is something about human social organization that tends to produce gender hierarchy, even if the specific forms vary. But tendency is not inevitability. The history of the past 2 centuries, with the gradual expansion of women's rights, education, and political participation, shows that gender hierarchy can be challenged and changed. The imagined order of patriarchy is not eternal. It is a human creation, and like all human creations, it is subject to revision. The chapter closes with a reflection on the relationship between justice and history. Harari argues that there is no justice in history, not because people have not tried to be just, but because justice is itself a fiction, an imagined order that exists only in human minds. The Code of Hammurabi was considered just by the Babylonians. The American Declaration of Independence was considered just by the Founding Fathers. Both claimed to be based on universal truths, but both were expressions of particular cultural and historical circumstances. There is no objective standard by which we can measure the justice of a social order. There are only different fictions, different imagined orders, different beliefs about what is right and what is wrong. This does not mean that we should abandon the pursuit of justice. It means that we should recognize that justice is something we create, not something we discover. We cannot look to nature or to the cosmos for a blueprint of the just society. We have to invent it ourselves, and we have to be humble enough to recognize that our inventions will be imperfect, that future generations may look back on our most cherished beliefs as we look back on the Code of Hammurabi as a relic of a less enlightened age. There is no justice in history, Harari writes. There is only history, and the people who make it, and the stories they tell themselves about why what they do is right. The chapter ends with that sobering observation. The imagined orders we have built, the hierarchies we have created, the injustices we have justified, are not the products of evil or stupidity. They are the products of our unique ability to believe in fictions. That ability is our greatest strength and our greatest weakness. It built the pyramids. It also built the slave ships. It is still building every day, and we are the architects. Whether we build justice or injustice depends on the stories we choose to believe, and the courage we have to change them when they stop serving us. The chapter closes there, not with an answer, but with a question. What stories will we tell tomorrow? Part 3. The Unification of Humankind. Chapter 9, The Arrow of History, marks a significant transition in Sapiens, moving from the examination of specific historical developments to a broader inquiry into the direction and meaning of human history as a whole. Harari opens by posing a deceptively simple question. Does history have a direction? Is there a pattern, a trend, a movement towards something? The common assumption in modern Western thought is that history moves toward greater freedom, greater equality, greater prosperity, greater knowledge. We call this progress. But Harari cautions that progress is not a law of nature. It is a story we tell ourselves, an imagined order like any other. The evidence of history does not unambiguously support the idea that things are getting better. The agricultural revolution, as he has already argued, made most people worse off. The rise of empires brought peace and order to some, but conquest and exploitation to many. The scientific revolution has given us unprecedented power over nature, but it has also given us nuclear weapons, environmental destruction, and the capacity for mass surveillance. The arrow of history, Harari suggests, is not an arrow of progress toward a predetermined good. It is an arrow of increasing scale, complexity, and integration. Human societies have grown from small foraging bands to vast empires and global systems. They have become more interconnected, more interdependent, more capable of coordinating action across continents. Whether this is good or bad depends on one's values and on the outcomes that one chooses to measure. Harari then introduces the three great forces that he argues have driven the unification of humankind. These forces are money, empire, and religion. Each of these is an imagined order, a shared fiction that has allowed strangers to cooperate on a scale that would otherwise be impossible. Money is the most universal and the most impersonal of the three. It is a system of mutual trust, a belief that a piece of paper, a metal coin, or a digital entry in a bank ledger has value because everyone else believes it has value. Money has no inherent worth. A dollar bill is not edible, not wearable, not useful for shelter, but it can be exchanged for food, clothing, and housing because the butcher, the tailor, and the landlord all accept it. Money has the unique ability to convert value from one form to another, to bridge gaps of culture, language, and geography. A Christian merchant in medieval Italy could trade with a Muslim merchant in Egypt because both trusted the value of gold and silver. A Chinese silk producer could sell to a Roman aristocrat because both accepted coins as payment. Money, Harari writes, is the great unifier. It speaks a language that everyone can understand, the language of price. It is the ultimate imagined order because it requires no belief in gods, nations, or ideologies. It only requires belief in the next transaction. The chapter then explores the nature of money in greater depth. Harari distinguishes between two types of money. The first is commodity money, objects that have intrinsic value as well as exchange value. Gold and silver are commodity money because they are rare, durable, divisible, and have aesthetic and industrial uses. The second is fiat money, objects that have no intrinsic value but are declared valuable by a government or other authority. Modern paper currency and digital bank deposits are fiat money. They are valuable only because the state says they are valuable, and because enough people believe the state will continue to exist and enforce that value. The shift from commodity money to fiat money is a shift in the nature of trust. Commodity money is trusted because of the physical properties of the commodity. Fiat money is trusted because of the credibility of the issuer. This shift has allowed for an enormous expansion of the money supply and has enabled the complex financial systems that underpin modern economies. But it has also introduced new forms of risk. Fiat money is only as trustworthy as the government that backs it. When governments collapse or lose credibility, their currencies can become worthless overnight. The history of money is the history of trust, and trust, like all imagined orders, is fragile. Harari then turns to the second great force of unification, empire. An empire, as he defines it, is a large, multi-ethnic, multicultural political unit that maintains its power through force, and that claims to be ruling for the benefit of all, not just for the benefit of the ruling group. Empires have been the dominant form of political organization for most of recorded history. The Persian Empire, the Roman Empire, the Chinese Empire, the Islamic Caliphates, the Mongol Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the British Empire. These and many others have shaped the political, economic, and cultural landscape of the world. Harari acknowledges that the empires have been responsible for immense suffering. They have conquered, enslaved, exploited, and killed millions of people. They have destroyed cultures and suppressed languages. But he also argues that empires have been a powerful force for unification. They have built roads, established legal systems, standardized weights and measures, promoted trade, spread technologies, and facilitated the movement of people and ideas across vast distances. The Roman Empire gave Europe a common language, Latin, a common law, a common engineering tradition, and a common religion, Christianity. The British Empire gave the world the English language, the common law tradition, parliamentary democracy, and the global network of ports and telegraph cables that made modern globalization possible. The legacy of empire is deeply ambivalent. It is impossible to separate the benefits of unification from the costs of conquest. But it is also impossible to imagine the modern world without the empires that shaped it. The chapter then addresses the relationship between empire and memory. Harari notes that empires are rarely remembered fondly by those they conquered. The subjects of empire often develop nationalist movements that define themselves in opposition to the imperial power. They tell stories of resistance, of heroes who fought against the oppressor, of a golden age before the empire came. These stories are important for identity and for political mobilization, but they can also obscure the extent to which the conquered have become part of the empire's cultural legacy. The post-colonial nations of the world, from India to Nigeria to Brazil, are not pre-colonial societies that have simply thrown off the imperial yoke. They are hybrid societies, shaped by the languages, legal systems, religions, and administrative structures of their former rulers. The arrow of empire is not reversible. Once a people has been incorporated into an imperial system, they cannot simply go back to the way things were before. The past is not a country to which we can return. The arrow moves only forward. Harari then introduces the third great force of unification: religion. He defines religion broadly as a system of human norms and values that is founded on a belief in a superhuman order. Religions unify by providing a shared framework of meaning that transcends local loyalties. A forager band might believe in the spirits of its own territory, but it has no reason to care about the spirits of a neighboring valley. A universal religion, Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, claims that its truths apply to all people, everywhere, regardless of their culture, language, or location. This universalism is what makes religion a force for unification. The spread of Christianity across Europe, the spread of Islam across the Middle East, North Africa, and Asia, and the spread of Buddhism across East Asia all brought diverse peoples under a common moral and ritual framework. They created imagined communities that stretched across continents. They also, of course, generated enormous conflict, as different religions competed for followers and as religious authorities clashed with political powers. But the conflicts, Harari argues, are evidence of the importance of religion as a unifying force. People do not fight over things that do not matter. They fight over things that matter deeply. And for most of human history, religion has been one of the things that matters most. The chapter closes with a reflection on the direction of history. Harari argues that the arrow of history points toward greater unity. The world of 20,000 years ago was a world of thousands of isolated human cultures, each with its own language, its own beliefs, its own way of life. The world of today is a single global system, connected by trade, finance, communication, travel, and shared environmental challenges. The forces of money, empire, and religion have woven the fabric of this system over millennia. They have been brutal, exploitative, and destructive. But they have also been creative, integrative, and transformative. The question that Harari poses to the reader is whether this unification is desirable. Is a single global civilization, with its shared values, its common institutions, its universal human rights discourse, better than the diverse, fragmented world of our ancestors? He does not answer this question. He cannot answer it, because the answer depends on values, that are themselves products of history. What he offers instead is a way of seeing history, not as a random walk or a spiral of progress, but as an arrow moving in a discernible direction toward larger scale, greater complexity, and deeper integration. Whether that arrow is pointing toward a target we want to hit is for us to decide. But we cannot decide unless we first understand the direction in which we are already moving. The chapter ends with Harari's observation that we are not passive passengers on the arrow of history. We are the archers. We do not know what we are aiming at, but we are drawing the bow and the arrow is in flight. Where it lands is, in part, up to us. The arrow of history is not a law of nature. It is a choice, and we are the ones who choose. Chapter 10. The Scent of Money continues the exploration of the forces that have unified humankind, focusing deeply on the first of the three great unifiers introduced in the previous chapter. Harari opens by asking the reader to imagine a world without money, a world of pure barter. In a barter economy, if a farmer wants to trade his apples for a pair of shoes, he must find a shoemaker who wants apples. If the shoemaker wants wheat instead, the farmer is out of luck. He must either find a third person who wants apples and has something the shoemaker wants, a chain of trades that quickly becomes impossibly complex, or he must give up on the transaction. Barter works well enough in small, simple societies where people know each other and exchange a limited range of goods. But as societies grow larger and more complex, the limitations of barter become crippling. There is no reliable way to store value across time. No way to compare the value of different goods. No way to facilitate transactions between strangers who have no reason to trust each other. Money solves these problems. It is a universal medium of exchange that can be traded for anything. It is a universal store of value that can be saved and used later. It is a universal unit of account that allows the value of apples, shoes, wheat, and labor to be compared on a single scale. Money, Harari writes, is the great converter. It turns the incommensurable into the commensurable. It allows us to translate the value of a painting, a loaf of bread, an hour of work, and a life of service into the same language of price. Harari then traces the history of money from its earliest forms to its modern manifestations. The first forms of money were not coins or paper, but commodities that had intrinsic value and were widely desired. Shells, cattle, salt, grains, furs, and beads have all served as money in different times and places. These commodity monies had the advantage of being useful in themselves, even if they were not being used for exchange. A cow could be milked or eaten. A measure of grain could be baked into bread, but commodity monies also had disadvantages. They were bulky, perishable, and not always easily divisible. A cow could not easily be divided into smaller units of value. A sack of grain could spoil or be eaten by pests. The invention of metal coins around 600 BCE in Lydia, in what is now Turkey, was a revolutionary advance. Coins were small, durable, portable, and easily divisible. They could be stamped with a mark guaranteeing their weight and purity, so that users did not have to weigh and test each piece of metal. The Lydian coins were made of electrum, a natural alloy of gold and silver, and they spread rapidly across the Mediterranean world. The idea of coinage was so successful that it was independently invented in China, India, and other regions. For the first time, strangers could trade with confidence, knowing that the coins they received would be accepted by others. The scent of money, Harari writes, is the scent of trust. Not trust in the person you are trading with, but trust in the abstract system of value that money represents. The chapter then explores the relationship between money and the development of complex societies. Harari argues that money is uniquely effective at bridging cultural divides because it is fundamentally impartial. Money does not care about your religion, your ethnicity, your nationality, or your social status. A coin from the hand of a Christian is worth the same as a coin from the hand of a Muslim, a Jew, a Hindu, or an atheist. This impartiality is what allows money to facilitate cooperation between people who have nothing else in common. A Spanish merchant in the 16th century could trade with an Ottoman merchant, a Chinese merchant, and an Indian merchant, all using the same silver coins even though they spoke different languages, worshipped different gods, and lived under different laws. Money is the first truly global language. It is the only thing that almost everyone, almost everywhere, is willing to accept. The spread of money, therefore, is a powerful force for the unification of humankind. It creates networks of trust and exchange that transcend local loyalties and cultural boundaries. Harari then addresses the apparent paradox of money's value. A dollar bill is a piece of paper with no intrinsic worth. A gold coin has some intrinsic worth as a metal, but its value as money is far greater than its value as a raw material. Why do people accept these objects in exchange for real goods and services? The answer, Harari argues, is trust. Money works because everyone believes that everyone else believes in it. This is a circular belief, but it is no less powerful for being circular. The trust that underlies money is not trust in a person or an institution, though those forms of trust are important. It is trust in an imagined order, a shared fiction that has no objective reality, but that shapes the behavior of billions of people. The dollar works because the United States government says it works, and because enough people believe that the government will continue to exist and to enforce that value. But the government's authority is itself based on trust, on the belief that the laws, the courts, the police, and the military are legitimate. At the foundation of the entire monetary system is a fiction, a story that enough people have agreed to believe. This is the scent of money. It is the smell of collective imagination. The chapter then examines the dark side of money. Money, Harari acknowledges, is not a force for universal good. It has been used to facilitate exploitation, oppression, and violence. The slave trade, perhaps the most brutal example of human exploitation, was enabled by money. African slave traders sold their captives for gold and guns. European merchants sold the enslaved for silver and sugar. American plantation owners bought them for cotton and tobacco. At every stage, money converted human beings into commodities, measured their worth in coins, and facilitated their transport across oceans. Money does not care about human dignity. It does not care about freedom or suffering. It only cares about value. And value in the monetary system is determined by what people are willing to pay. The same impartiality that allows money to bridge cultural divides also allows it to be used for purposes that most people would consider immoral. Money is a tool, and like any tool, it can be used for good or ill. The difference is that money is a tool that shapes the values of the society that uses it. When everything can be bought and sold, when human relationships are reduced to financial transactions, something essential is lost. Harari quotes the philosopher Michael Sandel, who argues that there are some things that money should not be able to buy, and that the tendency to extend market reasoning to every domain of life is corrosive to democracy and to human flourishing. The scent of money, for all its power to unify, is also the scent of a certain kind of emptiness. The chapter closes with a reflection on the future of money. Harari notes that we are living through another transformation in the nature of money, the shift from physical currency to digital transactions. Most of the money in the world today does not exist as coins or banknotes. It exists as electronic entries in the ledgers of banks and financial institutions. When you swipe a credit card or transfer funds online, you are not moving physical objects. You are updating a database. This digital money is even more abstract than paper currency. It has no physical form at all. It is pure information, pure trust, pure fiction, and yet it powers the global economy. Trillions of dollars change hands every day through electronic transfers, and the system works because enough people believe it works. The vulnerability of this system is the vulnerability of any imagined order. If trust collapses, if people stop believing that the digital entries have value, the entire edifice can come crashing down. Harari points to the financial crisis of 2008 as a reminder of how fragile our monetary system really is. A crisis of confidence in the mortgage market in the United States triggered a global recession, wiping out trillions of dollars of wealth, not because the physical goods of the world had disappeared, but because the fictions that underlay their value had been shaken. The scent of money is the scent of trust, and trust, Harari reminds us, is not a law of nature. It is a human choice, a human construction, and it can be unmade by human action. The chapter ends with Harari's observation that money is the most successful story ever told. It is believed by more people, across more cultures, over more time than any religion or any political ideology. But it is still just a story. The dollars in your wallet, the numbers on your bank statement, the gold in Fort Knox, they have value because we say they do, and we could say otherwise. The arrow of history is pointed toward greater monetary integration, but the arrow is not inevitable. It is guided by the choices we make, the trust we extend, and the stories we tell. The scent of money is all around us. It is the smell of the modern world. Whether it is a smell we want to keep breathing is a question that history cannot answer. It is a question for us, here and now, in the world that money has made. The chapter closes there, not with an answer, but with an invitation to consider what we value, what we trust, and what we are willing to pay. The scent of money is powerful, but it is not the only scent. There are other stories, other imaginings, other ways of being human. The question is whether we have the courage to imagine them. Chapter 11. Imperial Visions continues the examination of the forces that have unified humankind, turning now to the second great unifier introduced in Chapter 9, Empire. Harari opens by acknowledging the deeply ambivalent reputation of empires in modern discourse. The word empire conjures images of conquest, exploitation, violence, and cultural destruction. In the 20th century, the collapse of the European colonial empires was celebrated as a liberation, and the word imperialist became one of the most powerful political insults available. Harari does not dispute the brutality of empires. He does not minimize the suffering they caused. But he argues that a purely negative view of empires is historically incomplete. Empires, for all their flaws, have been one of the most powerful engines of human unification. They have brought together diverse peoples under common political, legal, and cultural frameworks. They have built infrastructure, facilitated trade, spread technologies, and created the conditions for the emergence of global systems. To understand the arrow of history, Harari insists, we must take empire seriously, not as a moral failure to be condemned, but as a historical force to be understood. Harari then defines what he means by empire. He offers two criteria. First, an empire must rule over a significant number of distinct peoples, each with its own culture, language, and identity. A kingdom that rules over a single homogeneous people is not an empire. Second, an empire must be flexible in its territorial claims. Empires do not have fixed natural borders. They can expand indefinitely, at least in principle. The Romans did not stop at Gaul. They went on to Britain, to Dacia, to Mesopotamia. The British did not stop at India. They went on to Burma, to Malaya, to Hong Kong. This combination of multi-ethnic rule and limitless ambition is what distinguishes empires from other forms of political organization. Empires are not content to rule their own people in their own land. They seek to rule everyone, everywhere, under a single authority. This universalism is both their driving force and their justification. Empires do not see themselves as conquerors imposing foreign rule. They see themselves as bringers of civilization, of order, of law, of peace, of the true religion, of the correct ideology. They believe, or claim to believe, that they are ruling for the benefit of the ruled. This belief, however sincere or cynical, is what makes empires possible. No one would fight and die to expand a system they believed was unjust. Empires need stories, myths of mission, visions of a better world under their dominion. The chapter then surveys the history of empires, from the earliest examples in ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt to the great imperial systems of the classical world, the Persian Empire, the Roman Empire, the Mauryan Empire in India, the Han Empire in China. Harari notes that for most of recorded history, the majority of humans have lived under some form of imperial rule. The idea of the nation-state, of a political unit that coincides with a single people, is a relatively recent invention. For millennia, the default assumption was that the world was or should be ruled by a single universal empire. The Persians, the Romans, the Chinese, the Arabs, the Mongols, the Ottomans, the Spanish, the British, all in their own ways pursued this vision. None succeeded in conquering the entire world, but each came closer than the last. The British Empire, at its height in the early 20th century, ruled over approximately a quarter of the world's land surface and a quarter of its population. The vision of universal empire was never fully realized, but it was never fully abandoned either. Even today, the idea of a single global order, governed by international law, enforced by a global security council, administered by global institutions, is a direct descendant of imperial thinking. The United Nations, for all its flaws, is an imperial vision, a dream of one world under one system of rules. Harari then explores the relationship between empire and culture. Empires, he argues, are not simply destroyers of culture, they are also creators and disseminators. The Roman Empire did not just conquer Greece, it absorbed Greek philosophy, Greek art, Greek literature, and Greek science, then spread these cultural products across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. Without Rome, the legacy of ancient Greece might have remained a local phenomenon. With Rome, it became the foundation of Western civilization. The Islamic caliphates did not just conquer Persia, Syria, Egypt, and Spain. They translated and preserved the works of Greek, Persian, and Indian scholars, then added their own innovations in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy, then spread this synthesized knowledge across a vast territory from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. Without the caliphates, the European Renaissance would have been impossible. The Mongol Empire, often remembered only for its brutality, facilitated the greatest era of overland trade and cultural exchange in pre-modern history. The Silk Road flourished under the Pax Mongolica, allowing technologies, ideas, and diseases to travel from China to Europe with unprecedented speed. Empires, Harari writes, are like rivers. They carve channels through the landscape of culture. The channels may be destructive, eroding local traditions and flooding indigenous practices, but they also create pathways for new connections, new syntheses, new forms of creativity that would not have existed without the imperial framework. The chapter then addresses the question of assimilation. Empires face a fundamental dilemma. On one hand, they need to maintain the distinct identities of the peoples they rule, because those identities are the justification for imperial rule. The British ruled India in part by arguing that Indians were not capable of ruling themselves, that they needed the civilizing influence of British law, education, and governance. To make this argument, the British had to maintain and even reinforce the idea of Indian difference. On the other hand, empires also need to assimilate their subjects to create a common culture that makes imperial administration possible. The British needed Indian clerks, Indian soldiers, Indian lawyers, Indian judges, all trained in British institutions, speaking English, understanding British law. This tension between maintaining difference and promoting assimilation is a defining feature of imperial rule. Different empires have managed it in different ways. The Romans were remarkably assimilative, granting citizenship to conquered elites and encouraging the spread of Roman language, law, and customs. The Assyrians were more brutal, deporting conquered populations and replacing them with loyal subjects. The Europeans in Africa were often more segregationist, maintaining rigid racial hierarchies that limited assimilation. But in all cases, the tension is present. Empires cannot survive without some degree of assimilation, and they cannot justify themselves without some degree of difference. Harari then turns to the legacy of empire in the post-colonial world. He notes that the former colonies of the European empires have inherited not only their independence, but also the cultural, political, and economic structures that their imperial rulers left behind. The borders of modern African and Middle Eastern nations, drawn by European diplomats in the 19th and early 20th centuries, often bear no relation to pre-existing ethnic, linguistic, or religious boundaries. The result has been decades of conflict, civil war, and state failure. The legal systems of many former colonies are based on European models. The official languages of India, Nigeria, and Singapore are English. The educational systems of former French colonies are modeled on French lycées. The economic infrastructure of much of the developing world was built to serve imperial interests, not local needs. The legacy of empire is inescapable. The post-colonial nations cannot simply return to a pre-colonial past because that past no longer exists. It has been overwritten by centuries of imperial rule. The task of building a post-imperial future is therefore not a task of restoration, but a task of creation. New nations must invent new identities, new institutions, new stories, drawing on the materials that history has left them, which include both their pre-colonial heritage and their colonial experience. This is difficult, painful, and often violent, but it is the only path forward. The chapter closes with a reflection on the future of empire. Harari argues that we are not living in a post-imperial age. We are living in an age of new empires, less visible but no less real. The global economic system, dominated by multinational corporations and international financial institutions, is a kind of empire. It rules without a single capital, without a single army, without a single legislature, but it rules nonetheless. The global legal order, with its international courts, treaties, and norms, is another kind of empire. It claims universal jurisdiction and seeks to impose its standards on all nations. The global human rights regime, the global environmental regime, the global health regime, all are imperial visions, attempts to create a single universal order. The difference between these new empires and the old ones is that the new empires do not rely on direct territorial control. They rule through rules, norms, incentives, and penalties. They are empires of persuasion, not conquest. Whether this is an improvement is an open question. Harari does not offer a verdict. He simply observes that the arrow of history points toward greater scale, greater integration, greater interdependence. The imperial vision, the dream of one world under one system, is as powerful today as it was when the first Persian king proclaimed himself King of Kings. The forms have changed. The substance remains. The chapter ends with Harari's observation that we are all, in some sense, imperial subjects now. We live under the rule of global systems that we did not choose, that we cannot easily escape, and that we do not fully understand. The question is not whether we can abolish empire. The question is whether we can make empire serve human flourishing rather than human exploitation. That is the imperial vision worth pursuing. The chapter closes there, not with an answer, but with a challenge. The empires of the past are gone, but the imperial imagination lives on. What we build with it is up to us. The arrow is still in flight. We are still the archers. Chapter 12, The Law of Religion, completes the examination of the three great forces that have unified humankind, turning now to the third and perhaps most powerful of them, religion. Harari opens by acknowledging that religion is often seen as a source of division, rather than unification. The wars of religion that scarred European history, the conflicts between Sunni and Shia Muslims, the tensions between Hindus and Muslims in South Asia, these and countless other examples seem to suggest that religion divides more than it unites. But Harari argues that this is a misunderstanding of the historical role of religion. Before the emergence of universal religions, human societies were even more fragmented. Each valley had its own spirits, its own rituals, its own taboos. There was no common framework for belief that could connect people across cultural boundaries. The great universal religions, Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, and others, were revolutionary precisely because they claimed that their truths applied to everyone, everywhere, regardless of local custom or tradition. A Christian missionary in China was not trying to impose the beliefs of a particular tribe. He was trying to convert the Chinese to what he believed was the one true faith for all humanity. This universalism is what made religion a force for unification. It created imagined communities that spanned continents and centuries. It gave strangers a common identity, a common set of values, and a common purpose. The wars that religions have fought are not evidence of their divisiveness. They are evidence of their power. People do not kill each other over things that do not matter. They kill each other over things that matter most. And for most of human history, religion has been one of those things. Harari then distinguishes between two types of religious belief that are often confused. The first is animism, the belief that the world is populated by spirits, ghosts, and other supernatural entities that are not organized into a coherent hierarchy. Animism was the dominant form of religious belief for most of human existence, and is still practiced by many indigenous peoples today. Animist beliefs are typically local, tied to specific places, animals, and natural features. They do not easily travel or convert. The second is theism, the belief in gods, powerful supernatural beings who control the universe and who demand worship, obedience, and sacrifice. Theism can be polytheistic, belief in many gods, or monotheistic, belief in a single supreme God. The universal religions that have unified humanity are all theistic or post-theistic. They claim that there is a superhuman order, a law of nature, or a divine will that applies to all people. This claim is what gives them their universal reach. A Christian does not need to know the local spirits of a foreign land. She already knows the one true God, and she knows that the local spirits are either demons or illusions. This confidence, this willingness to override local traditions in the name of a higher truth, is what allowed universal religions to spread across the world. The chapter then explores the relationship between religion and the other great unifiers, money and empire. Harari notes that money, empire, and religion have often worked together, sometimes in harmony and sometimes in tension. A merchant who trades across cultural boundaries needs a common framework of trust, which money provides. but also a common framework of meaning, which religion can provide. An emperor who rules over diverse peoples needs a common ideology to legitimize his rule, and religion has often served that purpose. The Roman Empire adopted Christianity as its state religion, not because Constantine had a personal conversion experience, though he may have, but because Christianity offered a universal ideology that could unite the diverse peoples of the empire under a single moral and legal framework. The Islamic caliphates united Arabs, Persians, Egyptians, Berbers, and many others under the banner of Islam. The Spanish Empire justified its conquest of the Americas by a papal bull that granted Spain the right to convert the indigenous peoples to Christianity. Money, empire, and religion are not separate forces. They are deeply intertwined, each reinforcing the others, each shaping the others, each contributing to the long arc of human unification. Harari then turns to the question of why universal religions emerged when they did. He argues that the agricultural revolution created the conditions for the development of large-scale, hierarchical societies, but it did not immediately produce universal religions. The first agricultural civilizations had complex pantheons of gods and elaborate ritual systems, but these were typically tied to specific city-states or empires. The god of Babylon was the protector of Babylon, not of the whole world. The Pharaoh of Egypt was the ruler of Egypt, not of all humanity. It was the expansion of empires, particularly the Persian Empire, the Mauryan Empire, and later the Roman Empire, that created the need for universal ideologies. An empire that rules over many peoples cannot rely on the local gods of its capital city. It needs a god, or a set of beliefs, that transcends local loyalties. The universal religions emerged in response to the universal ambitions of empire. Buddhism emerged in the context of the Mauryan Empire in India. Christianity emerged in the context of the Roman Empire. Islam emerged in the context of the Byzantine and Persian empires and then created its own empire. The arrow of empire and the arrow of religion are parallel arrows, pointing in the same direction toward greater scale and greater unity. The chapter then provides a detailed examination of three of the most influential universal religions: Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam. Harari presents each as a response to the same fundamental human problem, the problem of suffering, but each offers a different diagnosis and a different cure. Buddhism, as taught by Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, diagnosed suffering as arising from craving and attachment. The cure was to eliminate craving and attachment through meditation, ethical conduct, and wisdom, ultimately achieving nirvana, the extinction of the self and the end of suffering. Buddhism was not theistic in its original form. The Buddha was not a god, and he did not teach worship of any god. He taught a path, a method, a law of nature that anyone could follow regardless of their cultural background. This universalism made Buddhism highly adaptable, and it spread from its birthplace in northeastern India across Central Asia, East Asia, and Southeast Asia. Christianity, by contrast, was theistic from its beginning. It taught that suffering was a consequence of sin, and that sin was a rebellion against the one true God. The cure was faith in Jesus Christ, the Son of God, who died to atone for human sin and rose from the dead to conquer death. Christianity also claimed universal truth. Jesus was not just the Savior of the Jews, he was the Savior of all humanity. This universalism, combined with the missionary zeal of its followers and the political support of the Roman Empire, allowed Christianity to spread across Europe and beyond. Islam, the youngest of the three, combined elements of both. It taught that there is one God, Allah, and that Muhammad is his final prophet. Suffering and sin are the result of forgetting or rejecting God. The cure is submission to God's will, expressed through prayer, charity, fasting, and pilgrimage. Islam also claimed universal truth and was accompanied from its beginning by imperial expansion. Within a century of Muhammad's death, Muslim armies had conquered an empire stretching from Spain to India. Each of these religions, in its own way, offered a vision of a universal order that transcended local loyalties and gave meaning to individual lives. The chapter then addresses the relationship between religion and science, a topic that will be explored in more depth later in the book. Harari notes that many people assume that science and religion are in conflict, that science is about facts and religion is about values, and that the two are fundamentally incompatible. He argues that this is a misunderstanding. Both science and religion are systems of belief that claim to describe reality. They differ in their methods and their domains, but they are not necessarily opposed. A religious believer can accept the findings of science about the age of the universe or the mechanisms of evolution, as long as those findings do not contradict core theological claims. A scientist can accept that there are moral and ethical questions that science cannot answer, as long as those questions are not framed in terms that contradict scientific findings. The real conflict, Harari suggests, is not between science and religion as abstract systems, but between different claims about the nature of reality and the source of moral authority. The scientific revolution, which we will explore in later chapters, did not abolish religion. It shifted the source of authority from scripture and tradition to observation and experiment. But the questions that religion addresses, questions of meaning, purpose, and value, are still with us. They are still unanswered. They may be unanswerable. The law of religion, Harari writes, is the law of meaning. It is the human need for a story that makes sense of suffering, that gives purpose to existence, that connects the individual to something larger than themselves. That need has not disappeared. It has only changed its forms. The chapter closes with a reflection on the future of religion. Harari notes that in the modern world, traditional religions have lost much of their authority. Fewer people attend services, fewer people believe in traditional doctrines, fewer people shape their lives around religious commandments. But this has not led to a world without meaning. It has led to the proliferation of new forms of belief that function like religions, even if they are not called religions. Nationalism, communism, capitalism, human rights, liberalism, these are all secular religions, systems of belief that offer a vision of the good life, a set of values, a source of meaning, and a justification for action. They have their own scriptures, their own prophets, their own rituals, their own heresies, their own inquisitions. They demand sacrifice, inspire devotion, and justify violence. The law of religion, Harari argues, is not the law of God. It is the law of the human imagination. We cannot live without meaning. We cannot cooperate in large numbers without shared stories. The forms of all those stories change, but the need for them does not. The chapter ends with Harari's observation that we are not post-religious. We are just post-traditional. The gods of our ancestors have not been abolished. They have been replaced by new gods, and those new gods are no less powerful, no less demanding, and no less dangerous. The arrow of history points toward greater scale, greater integration, greater interdependence. It does not point toward the end of religion. It points toward the transformation of religion from the worship of supernatural beings to the worship of human creations, nations, markets, rights, progress. The law of religion is the law of our own making. We are the lawgivers now. The question is whether we are wise enough to give good laws. The chapter closes there, not with an answer, but with a question. What do we believe? Why do we believe it? And what are we willing to do for our beliefs? The arrow is still in flight. The law is still being written. We are the scribes. We are the gods. We are the believers, and we are the ones who will have to live with what we have made. Chapter 13, The Secret of Success, marks a significant shift in the structure of Sapiens, moving from the historical narrative of human development to a more analytical inquiry into how we should understand the process of history itself. Harari opens by acknowledging a paradox that runs throughout his account. If, as he has argued, the agricultural revolution was a catastrophe for the majority of humans, making them less healthy, less secure, and less free than their foraging ancestors, then why did it happen? Why did humanity walk willingly into a trap? And why, once trapped, did no one find a way out? The standard answer, that people are ignorant or short-sighted, is not sufficient. The transition to agriculture took place over thousands of years, across multiple continents, involving countless generations of humans making decisions that seemed reasonable at the time. No one foresaw the full consequences. No one intended to create a world of toil, inequality, and disease. But the cumulative effect of countless small, rational decisions was a catastrophe. This, Harari suggests, is the secret of success in history. Success is not a matter of superior intelligence or superior morality. It is a matter of chance, of feedback loops, of self-reinforcing dynamics that have nothing to do with the well-being of the individuals caught up in them. Harari then introduces the concept of the evolutionary approach to history. Just as natural selection favors traits that increase reproductive success, regardless of whether those traits make individual organisms happier or healthier, so too does cultural selection favor practices that increase the scale and power of human societies, regardless of whether those practices make individual humans better off. Agriculture spread not because it made farmers happier than foragers, but because farming allowed for higher population densities. A square mile of farmland can support 10 times as many people as a square mile of wild forest. Those 10 farmers, even if each one was individually worse off than each forager, collectively had more military power, more economic output, and more cultural influence than the foraging band. They could overwhelm or absorb their foraging neighbors not through conscious conquest, but simply through the pressure of numbers. Over time, the proportion of farmers in the human population increased, and the proportion of foragers decreased. Not because farming was a better way of life, but because it was a more successful way of replicating itself. This is the secret of success. The winners in history are not the ones who are right, or good, or wise. They are the ones who happen to stumble upon a formula that allowed them to grow faster, to spread farther, to outcompete their rivals: morality, happiness, justice. These are not the currencies of history. The currency of history is replication. The chapter then examines several historical examples of this dynamic. The spread of Islam in the 7th and 8th centuries is often explained by the zeal of its followers or the appeal of its doctrines. Harari does not deny that these factors played a role, but he points to a more mundane factor as well. The Islamic caliphates controlled the most fertile and strategically located regions of the Old World, from the Nile to the Oxus. They inherited the agricultural and commercial infrastructure of the Byzantine and Persian empires. They taxed this wealth efficiently and used it to support the world's most powerful armies. These armies conquered new territories, which brought in new wealth, which supported larger armies, which conquered more territories. The feedback loop was self-reinforcing. Islam spread not only because people converted, but because Muslim societies had an organizational and military advantage that allowed them to dominate their neighbors. The same dynamic applies to the spread of Christianity in Europe, the spread of Confucianism in East Asia, and the spread of capitalism in the modern world. Success breeds success. Power attracts power. The rich get richer, the strong get stronger, and the stories that serve the strong become the stories that everyone believes. Harari then addresses the question of whether history is random. He argues that it is neither fully random nor fully determined. The broad patterns of history, the rise of agriculture, the growth of empires, the spread of universal religions, the scientific revolution, these are not accidents. They are driven by underlying forces, by population pressure, by competition, by the logic of scale. But within these broad patterns, there is enormous contingency. Small events can have large consequences. A change in the weather, a mutation in a pathogen, the birth of a particular individual, the outcome of a particular battle, can shift the trajectory of history in ways that no one could have predicted. Harari uses the example of the Roman Empire. Was the rise of Rome inevitable? Not at all. In the 4th century BCE, Rome was a minor city-state in central Italy, one of many. Its rise to dominance was the result of a series of lucky breaks, strategic decisions, and military innovations that could easily have gone differently. Had Hannibal marched on Rome after his victory at Cannae, had the Romans not learned to build a navy, had the Etruscan League united against them, the history of Europe would have been very different. But these events did not happen. Rome rose. And once Rome rose, it created conditions that made its continued dominance more likely. The Roman army was the best in the Mediterranean. The Roman road network allowed for rapid movement of troops. Tractatrati Visanani. The Roman legal system created a stable framework for trade and governance. The feedback loop was self-reinforcing. Success led to more success. This is the pattern of history. Contingent origins, followed by self-reinforcing dynamics, followed by outcomes that appear, in retrospect, to have been inevitable. But they were not inevitable. They were just the paths that were taken. The chapter then explores the implications of this view for our understanding of human progress. Harari is deeply skeptical of narratives that present history as a story of moral or intellectual improvement. The agricultural revolution did not make people better off. The rise of empires did not make people more free. The scientific revolution has given us unprecedented power, but it has also given us nuclear weapons, environmental destruction, and the capacity for mass surveillance. Are we happier than our foraging ancestors? The evidence is ambiguous at best. Are we wiser? There is no evidence for that at all. The secret of success, Harari argues, is that there is no secret. Success is not a reward for virtue. It is not a measure of worth. It is simply a description of what happened. The winners write the histories, and they write them in a way that makes their success seem natural, inevitable, and deserved. But this is a story, not a fact. The foragers who were displaced by farmers were not inferior. They were just outnumbered. The indigenous peoples who were conquered by Europeans were not less civilized. The Gesuranturan, they were just less resistant to the diseases that Europeans brought. The societies that dominate the modern world are not superior. They are just the ones that happen to be in the right place at the right time, with the right combination of factors that allowed them to grow and spread. Harari then turns to the question of whether we can learn from history. If history is driven by contingent events and self-reinforcing dynamics, then the past is not a reliable guide to the future. What worked for the Romans may not work for us. What failed for the foragers may not fail for us. The world changes, and the lessons of one era may be the superstitions of the next. This does not mean that history is useless. It means that we must be cautious in how we use it. History can show us patterns, but it cannot give us predictions. It can show us possibilities, but it cannot give us certainties. It can show us that things could have been different, which is perhaps the most important lesson of all. The world we live in is not the only world that could exist. The social arrangements we take for granted, the hierarchies, the inequalities, the institutions, are not laws of nature. They are human creations, and they can be changed. The secret of success, Harari suggests, is not a formula for success. It is the recognition that success is contingent, that the winners are not necessarily the wisest, and that the future is open. We are not prisoners of history, we are participants in it. And the choices we make, individually and collectively, will shape the course of history for generations to come. The chapter closes with a reflection on the responsibility that comes with this understanding. If history is not a story of progress toward a predetermined goal, then we cannot simply trust that things will work out for the best. We must actively work to create the future we want. This is a daunting task, and there are no guarantees of success. But it is also a liberating task, because it means that we are not bound by the past. The foragers did not have to become farmers. The subjects of the empires did not have to accept their subordination. The believers in traditional religions did not have to abandon their doubts. They made choices, constrained by circumstances, but choices nonetheless. We are making choices too every day in the way we live, the way we consume, the way we treat others, the way we think about the world. These choices will determine the future of our species and of all life on Earth. The secret of success is that there is no secret. There is only the ongoing, uncertain, and endlessly fascinating process of history unfolding in real time, with us as both the actors and the audience. The chapter ends with Harari's observation that we are not the culmination of history. We are not its final product. We are just another chapter, another turn of the screw, another step on a path that stretches into an unknown future. The arrow of history is still in flight. We are still the archers. What we aim at and what we hit is up to us. The secret of success, if there is one, is that there is no secret. There is only the courage to act, the humility to learn, and the wisdom to know that we do not know. The chapter closes there, not with an answer, but with an invitation. History is not a puzzle to be solved. It is a story to be written. And we are the writers. The pen is in our hands. The page is blank. What will we write? The arrow is still in flight. The story is not over. It is just beginning. Part 4. The Scientific Revolution. Chapter 14, The Discovery of Ignorance, marks the transition from the earlier sections of the book to the final major revolution in human history, the scientific revolution. Harari opens with a startling claim. Until approximately 500 years ago, humans did not believe that they could discover new knowledge that would fundamentally transform their lives. They believed that all important knowledge was already known, contained in ancient scriptures, in the wisdom of past generations, in the traditions of their elders. The role of the scholar was not to discover new truths, but to preserve, transmit, and interpret the truths that had already been revealed. This is not because pre-modern people were stupid or incurious. They asked many questions about the world. They observed the stars, cataloged plants and animals, developed sophisticated technologies. But they did not believe that systematic, empirical investigation could lead to the discovery of entirely new, powerful, and transformative knowledge. They did not believe that they could admit their ignorance, and then, through observation and experiment, replace that ignorance with reliable knowledge. This belief, the belief in the value of ignorance, is what Harari calls the discovery of ignorance. It is the foundation of modern science. Harari then contrasts the pre-modern attitude with the modern scientific attitude. A medieval European scholar confronted with a question about the natural world would consult the Bible, or Aristotle, or Galen, or some other ancient authority. If the authority had spoken on the question, the matter was settled. If the authority had not spoken, the question was either unimportant or unanswerable. The scholar did not conduct experiments to test the authority's claims because the authority was presumed to be infallible, or at least more reliable than any individual's observation. A modern scientist, by contrast, begins with the assumption that she does not know. She formulates a hypothesis, designs an experiment, collects data, analyzes results, and revises her hypothesis accordingly. She does not consult an ancient authority because she assumes that ancient authorities, however brilliant, did not have access to the methods and instruments that are available today. The core of the scientific attitude is the admission of ignorance, the willingness to be wrong, and the commitment to subject all claims, including one's own, to empirical test. This attitude, Harari argues, is historically unprecedented. No other culture, no other era, developed it in a systematic, institutionalized way. The scientific revolution is not a revolution in knowledge. It is a revolution in ignorance. It is the discovery that we do not know, and that not knowing is the first step toward knowing. The chapter then explores the historical conditions that made the discovery of ignorance possible. Harari identifies three key factors. The first is the willingness to admit ignorance, which required a break with the authority of ancient texts and traditions. This break was gradual and contested. It involved conflicts between scientists and religious authorities, between empiricists and rationalists, between innovators and traditionalists. The second factor is the emphasis on observation and mathematics. Modern science does not rely on pure reason or on authority. It relies on the systematic collection of empirical data and the mathematical analysis of that data. This combination, empiricism and mathematics, is the engine of scientific progress. The third factor is the acquisition of new powers. Science is not just about knowledge for its own sake. It is about knowledge that can be used to create new technologies, to control nature, to improve human life. This link between science and technology, between knowledge and power, is a distinctive feature of modern science. Pre-modern scholars were often content to understand the world without trying to change it. Modern scientists are driven by the desire to understand and to control. This desire, Harari argues, is what gives science its momentum and its danger. Harari then turns to the relationship between science and the other great forces of unification, empire, and capitalism. He argues that the scientific revolution did not occur in a vacuum. It was fueled by the ambitions of European empires and the energies of European capitalism. European explorers sailing to the Americas, Africa, and Asia encountered plants, animals, peoples, and diseases that were not described in any ancient text. They were forced to admit their ignorance, and they were forced to develop new methods for cataloging and understanding the vast diversity of the world. The empires that sponsored these voyages demanded practical knowledge that could be used to extract resources, to control populations, to win wars. Science served empire, and empire funded science. At the same time, European capitalism, with its emphasis on investment, risk, and return, created a demand for reliable knowledge about markets, resources, and technologies. The scientific method, with its emphasis on empirical data and mathematical analysis, provided a framework for producing such knowledge. Science served capitalism, and capitalism funded science. The discovery of ignorance, Harari argues, was not a purely intellectual event. It was a historical event, shaped by the specific political and economic conditions of early modern Europe. The chapter then provides a detailed examination of the development of the scientific method. Harari traces the key innovations that transformed natural philosophy into modern science. The development of the experimental method, associated with figures like Francis Bacon and Galileo Galilei. Bacon argued that knowledge should be built on empirical observation, not on ancient authority. Galileo used the telescope to make observations that contradicted the teachings of Aristotle and the Church. The development of mathematical tools for analyzing data, including probability theory, calculus, and statistics. These tools allowed scientists to quantify their observations, to detect patterns, to make predictions. The institutionalization of science, the creation of scientific societies, journals, and universities that provided a framework for the sharing and testing of knowledge. The Royal Society of London, founded in 1660, is a paradigmatic example. Its motto, nullius in verba, take no one's word for it, captures the spirit of the new science. Knowledge was no longer to be accepted on authority. It was to be tested by observation and experiment. This institutional framework, Harari argues, is as important as any individual discovery. It created a self-correcting system, a collective enterprise that could accumulate knowledge over generations, building on the work of others, correcting errors, refining theories. No single scientist, no matter how brilliant, could have produced the edifice of modern science. It is a collaborative achievement, spanning centuries and continents. The chapter closes with a reflection on the implications of the discovery of ignorance for the human condition. Harari argues that the scientific attitude, the willingness to admit ignorance and to seek new knowledge, has transformed every aspect of human life. It has given us modern medicine, which has dramatically reduced infant mortality and extended life expectancy. It has given us modern agriculture, which has allowed us to feed a global population of billions. It has given us modern transportation and communication, which have shrunk the world and connected humanity as never before. It has given us nuclear weapons, which have the power to end civilization. It has given us the capacity to alter the climate of the entire planet. The power that science has given us is unprecedented, and the responsibility that comes with that power is equally unprecedented. We are no longer passive observers of the natural world. We are active participants, capable of reshaping the world in ways that our ancestors could not have imagined. The discovery of ignorance, Harari writes, is not just a discovery about the limits of our knowledge. It is a discovery about the limits of our wisdom. We have learned how to do many things. We have not learned how to choose which things to do. The arrow of science points toward greater power, but it does not point toward greater wisdom. That is something we must find for ourselves. The chapter ends with Harari's observation that we are living in the age of the discovery of ignorance, but we have not yet discovered the wisdom to match it. The questions that science cannot answer, questions of meaning, purpose, and value, are more pressing than ever. We have the power to destroy ourselves. We have the power to remake ourselves. What we lack is the wisdom to know what we should do. The discovery of ignorance was the beginning of modern history. The discovery of wisdom, if it comes, will be its end. The arrow is still in flight. We are still the archers. What we aim at and what we hit will determine the future of life on Earth. The chapter closes there not with an answer, but with a challenge. We have discovered ignorance. Now we must discover responsibility. The arrow is in our hands. The target is the future. Let us aim carefully. The story is not over. It is just beginning. Chapter 15. The Marriage of Science and Empire explores the symbiotic relationship between the scientific revolution and European imperialism, arguing that these two forces, often treated separately, are deeply intertwined and mutually reinforcing. Harari opens with a provocative question. Why did the scientific revolution occur in Europe and not in China, India, or the Islamic world? These civilizations were in many ways more advanced than Europe in the 15th century. China had vast fleets that sailed the Indian Ocean. The Islamic world had preserved and expanded upon Greek knowledge. India had made sophisticated mathematical and astronomical discoveries. Yet it was Europe, a relative backwater, that launched the voyages of discovery, developed the scientific method, and ultimately dominated the globe. Harari's answer is not that Europeans were smarter or more curious. It is that they were driven by a unique combination of imperial ambition and capitalist energy, and that they were willing to admit ignorance in a way that other civilizations were not. The marriage of science and empire was a marriage of convenience, but it was also a marriage of love. Each partner gave the other what it needed. Empire gave science resources, data, and practical problems to solve. Science gave empire maps, weapons, medicines, and the ideological justification for conquest. The chapter then traces the history of European exploration, from the Portuguese voyages down the coast of Africa to the Spanish conquest of the Americas, to the circumnavigation of the globe by Magellan's expedition. Harari emphasizes that these voyages were not motivated by pure curiosity. They were motivated by a search for gold, for spices, for souls to convert, and for strategic advantage over rival powers. But they could not have succeeded without scientific and technological advances. The development of the caravel, a ship capable of sailing against the wind, allowed Europeans to explore coastlines that were previously inaccessible. The improvement of navigational instruments, such as the astrolabe and the cross staff, allowed sailors to determine their latitude with increasing accuracy. The creation of more accurate maps, incorporating information from multiple voyages, allowed subsequent explorers to build on the knowledge of their predecessors. These were not purely scientific achievements. They were practical responses to imperial needs, but they had scientific consequences. The data collected by explorers, the plants, animals, peoples, and landscapes they encountered, challenged the authority of ancient texts and forced Europeans to develop new ways of understanding the world. The discovery of the Americas, Harari writes, was the great shock that shattered the old worldview. No ancient text had mentioned a continent between Europe and Asia. No authority had predicted the existence of peoples, plants, and animals that were unknown to the Greeks and the Romans. The only way to make sense of this new world was to admit ignorance and to rely on observation and experiment. The marriage of science and empire was consummated in the Americas. Harari then examines the role of scientific knowledge in the European conquest of the world. He argues that the advantage of Europeans was not simply technological, it was also cognitive. Europeans had developed a type of knowledge that was explicitly designed to be useful, to be tested, and to be shared. Chinese and Islamic cartography, for example, was often focused on local or regional geography and was embedded in cultural and religious frameworks that limited its utility for long-distance exploration. European cartography was focused on accuracy, on standardization, on the creation of maps that could be used by any navigator, regardless of their cultural background. Similarly, European botany and zoology developed systems of classification, such as the Linnean system, that allowed researchers to identify and compare species from different parts of the world. This knowledge was not just descriptive, it was also practical. European scientists learned which plants could be used for medicine, which for food, which for dyes, which for timber. They learned which animals could be domesticated, which were dangerous, which were sources of valuable products. This knowledge, systematically collected and disseminated through scientific societies and journals, gave Europeans a significant advantage over the peoples they encountered. The marriage of science and empire was not just about conquest. It was about knowledge that enabled conquest. The chapter then addresses the relationship between science and the ideology of empire. Harari argues that science provided a powerful justification for European imperialism. The scientific claim that Europeans were more advanced, more rational, more civilized than the peoples they conquered was used to legitimate conquest, enslavement, and cultural destruction. The theory of racial hierarchy, developed by European anthropologists and biologists in the 19th century, provided a pseudo-scientific basis for treating non-Europeans as inferior. The theory of social evolution, which posited that human societies progress through stages from savagery to barbarism to civilization, allowed Europeans to see themselves as the vanguard of humanity and their conquests as a necessary, even benevolent process. These scientific theories were not neutral. They were shaped by the imperial context in which they were developed, and they served the interests of the imperial powers. But Harari is careful to note that science was not simply a tool of empire. It also contained within it the seeds of critique. The same empirical methods that were used to justify racial hierarchy could be used to undermine it. The same commitment to observation and evidence that supported social evolution could be turned against it. The marriage of science and empire was not a relationship of equals. Empire was the senior partner, and science often served its interests, but the relationship was also dynamic, contested, and capable of producing unexpected consequences. The chapter then examines the role of scientific knowledge in the transformation of non-European societies. Harari argues that the encounter with European science was often devastating for indigenous peoples, not only because it provided Europeans with the means of conquest, but also because it undermined indigenous knowledge systems. Indigenous peoples had their own ways of understanding the world, their own technologies, their own medicines, their own agricultural practices. These knowledge systems were often sophisticated and well adapted to local conditions. But they were not based on the same principles as European science. They were often embedded in religious and cultural frameworks that made them difficult to separate from the societies that produced them. When European missionaries, administrators, and scientists arrived, they dismissed indigenous knowledge as superstition and ignorance. They imposed their own categories, their own classifications, their own ways of knowing. This epistemic violence, the destruction of indigenous knowledge systems, was as destructive as the physical violence of conquest. It alienated indigenous peoples from their own traditions, their own identities, their own ways of making sense of the world. The marriage of science and empire was not just about the acquisition of knowledge. It was also about the destruction of knowledge. What was lost in the process, Harari suggests, is incalculable. The chapter closes with a reflection on the legacy of the marriage of science and empire. Harari argues that we are still living with the consequences of this relationship. The global order of today, with its inequalities, its hierarchies, its distributions of wealth and power, is a direct legacy of European imperialism, enabled and legitimated by European science. The scientific institutions of the modern world, the universities, the research centers, the funding agencies, are still concentrated in the countries that were the imperial powers. The languages of science, English, French, German, are the languages of empire. The categories that we use to understand the world, the divisions between races, between cultures, between developed and developing, are products of imperial science. But the marriage of science and empire is not irreversible. The methods of science, the commitment to observation, to evidence, to the testing of hypotheses, can be turned against the legacies of empire. Post-colonial scholars, indigenous scientists, and critical historians are using the tools of science to challenge the assumptions on which imperial science was built. They are showing that the knowledge of the colonized was not inferior, but different. They are demonstrating that the categories of race and civilization are social constructions, not natural kinds. They are recovering the knowledge that was lost and using it to build a more just and inclusive science. The chapter ends with Harari's observation that the marriage of science and empire is not a one-way street. It is a relationship that has shaped both partners and that continues to evolve. We cannot undo the past. We cannot recover what was lost, but we can learn from it. We can use the tools of science to critique the abuses of science. We can build a future in which knowledge serves human flourishing, not just imperial ambition. The arrow of history is still in flight. We are still the archers. What we aim at and what we hit will determine whether the marriage of science and empire ends in divorce or in a more just partnership. The chapter closes there, not with an answer, but with a challenge. The scientific revolution gave us unprecedented power. The imperial legacy gave us unprecedented inequality. The task of the present is to use the power to reduce the inequality. Whether we succeed is not predetermined. It is up to us. The arrow is in our hands. The target is the future. Let us aim wisely. The story is not over. It is just beginning. Chapter 18, A Permanent Revolution, explores the ongoing, accelerating transformation of human society in the wake of the Industrial Revolution, arguing that the pace of change has become so rapid that it has fundamentally altered the relationship between past, present, and future. Harari opens by observing that for most of human history, the lives of children were very similar to the lives of their parents and grandparents. A farmer in medieval France lived much like his father had lived and his grandfather before him. The tools changed slowly, the crops changed slowly, the social structures changed slowly. A person could reasonably expect to live their entire life within a world that was recognizable to someone from the previous generation. The Industrial Revolution shattered this continuity. Today, the world of a 20-year-old is often unrecognizable to their grandparents. Technologies that did not exist a decade ago are now ubiquitous. Social norms that were unthinkable a generation ago are now taken for granted. Careers that did not exist when parents were in school are now the most sought-after professions. The revolution that began in the 18th century has become permanent. It does not end. It accelerates. We are living in a state of permanent revolution, where the only constant is change. Harari then examines the consequences of this permanent revolution for human identity and social cohesion. In traditional societies, identity was largely inherited. You were born into a family, a clan, a caste, a religion, a village. These identities were stable, enduring, and largely unchosen. They gave life meaning and structure, but they also limited possibilities. In modern societies, identity has become increasingly fluid, flexible, and self-constructed. You can change your career, your religion, your political affiliation, your place of residence, even your gender. This freedom is liberating, but it is also disorienting. The stable markers of identity that anchored previous generations have eroded. Many people experience a sense of rootlessness, of dislocation, of not knowing who they are or where they belong. The permanent revolution has freed us from the constraints of tradition, but it has also left us adrift in a sea of infinite possibility. The challenge of the modern era is not just to create new technologies and new institutions. It is to create new forms of meaning, new sources of identity, new ways of belonging that can survive the constant churn of change. The chapter then explores the transformation of the family and the community. In traditional societies, the extended family was the primary unit of economic production, social support, and cultural transmission. People lived their entire lives in close proximity to parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins. The community was face-to-face, intimate, and demanding. The Industrial Revolution broke this pattern. It drew people from rural villages into urban centers, from agricultural labor into factory work, from extended families into nuclear households. The bonds of kinship weakened. The authority of elders declined. The community became more anonymous, more transient, more voluntary. People began to choose their friends, their partners, their neighbors, rather than inheriting them. This transformation brought new freedoms, especially for women, for young people, and for those who did not fit into traditional roles. But it also brought new forms of loneliness, isolation, and vulnerability. The permanent revolution has dissolved the old structures of solidarity. It has not yet created new ones that are equally robust. Harari then turns to the transformation of time and the sense of the future. In traditional societies, the future was largely expected to resemble the past. People saved for known contingencies, the lean years, the old age, the illness. They did not invest in the expectation of perpetual growth because perpetual growth was unimaginable. The permanent revolution has inverted this relationship. The future is now expected to be different from the past and better. People save and invest, not just for contingencies, but for opportunities, for the chance to participate in the growth that they expect to continue. Governments borrow against future tax revenues, assuming that the economy will grow enough to service the debt. Corporations pour billions into research and development, betting that new technologies will create new markets. The belief in the future has become the engine of the present. But this belief is fragile. It depends on the continuation of growth, and growth depends on the continued exploitation of resources, the continued expansion of credit, the continued stability of the global system. A major disruption, a financial crash, a climate catastrophe, a pandemic could shatter the belief in the future and bring the whole edifice crashing down. The permanent revolution is built on a foundation of trust, and trust is not a law of nature. It is a human choice. The chapter then examines the relationship between the permanent revolution and political ideology. Harari argues that the three great political ideologies of the modern era, liberalism, communism, and fascism, were all responses to the upheavals of the Industrial Revolution. Each offered a vision of how to manage change, how to distribute its benefits, how to mitigate its harms. Liberalism promised individual freedom, market competition, and gradual reform. Communism promised collective ownership, central planning, and revolutionary transformation. Fascism promised national unity, racial purity, and authoritarian control. Each ideology had its moment, its successes, its failures, and its atrocities. But all three shared a common assumption, that the future could be shaped by human action, that the permanent revolution could be directed toward desirable ends. This assumption is now being tested as never before. The challenges of the 21st century, climate change, artificial intelligence, biotechnology, are global in scale and unprecedented in complexity. The old ideologies are struggling to provide coherent responses. New ideologies are emerging, but none has yet gained the authority that liberalism, communism, and fascism once held. The permanent revolution has outpaced our political imagination. We are living in a time of ideological confusion, where the old certainties have crumbled and the new certainties have not yet been built. The chapter closes with a reflection on the psychological toll of the permanent revolution. Harari argues that the constant pressure to adapt, to learn, to change, to improve is exhausting. Humans did not evolve to live in a state of permanent flux. Our brains and bodies are adapted to the relatively stable conditions of the Paleolithic, not to the dizzying pace of modern life. The result is an epidemic of stress, anxiety, and depression. Rates of mental illness have skyrocketed in industrial societies. The pursuit of happiness, promised by the ideologies of the permanent revolution, has proved elusive. People are richer, healthier, and more free than ever before, but they are not obviously happier. The permanent revolution has delivered material abundance. It has not delivered meaning. The challenge of the future is not just to sustain growth, to manage technology, to protect the planet. It is to find ways of living that are sustainable, not just ecologically, but psychologically. We need stories that can anchor us in the flux, communities that can support us in the loneliness, purposes that can guide us in the confusion. The permanent revolution has destroyed the old answers. It has not provided new ones. The arrow of history is still in flight. We are still the archers, but we are also the targets. The revolution is permanent. The question is whether we can learn to live with it, to shape it, to find meaning within it. The chapter ends with Harari's observation that the permanent revolution is not going to end. It is going to accelerate. The pace of change will only increase. The challenge of the 21st century is not to stop the revolution. It is to survive it and to thrive within it. That will require not just new technologies and new institutions, but new forms of wisdom, new ways of being human. The story is not over. It is just beginning. The wheels are still turning. We are still here. What we become and what we make of the world is up to us. The arrow is in our hands. The target is the future. Let us aim wisely. The permanent revolution is our inheritance. It is also our responsibility. What we do with it will determine the fate of our species. The chapter closes there, not with an answer, but with a question. In a world of permanent change, what does it mean to be human? That is the question of our time, and we are the ones who must answer it. Chapter 19, "And they lived happily ever after," confronts one of the most fundamental questions raised by the entire narrative of Sapiens. After all the revolutions, all the transformations, all the increases in power and wealth and knowledge, are humans actually happier than their ancestors? The standard narrative of progress assumes that the answer is yes, that more is better, that richer, healthier, longer lives are happier lives. Harari challenges this assumption. He argues that the relationship between material conditions and subjective well-being is far more complex than we commonly assume. There is no doubt that modern humans live longer, suffer less from infectious disease, have access to a greater variety of food and entertainment, and are less likely to die violently than their ancestors. But does any of this translate into greater happiness? The evidence, Harari suggests, is ambiguous at best. Surveys of subjective well-being show that people in wealthy countries are not significantly happier than people in poorer countries, as long as basic needs are met. People who win the lottery are not happier a year later than people who did not. People who become paraplegic are not less happy a year later than people who did not. The human mind has a remarkable capacity to adapt to changing circumstances, both good and bad. The hedonic treadmill. The tendency to return to a baseline level of happiness regardless of life events suggests that the pursuit of happiness through external means may be futile. Harari then examines the biological and psychological research on happiness. He distinguishes between 3 levels of happiness. The first level is momentary pleasure, the feeling of enjoyment that comes from a good meal, a warm embrace, a beautiful sunset. This level is transient. It fades quickly, and the pursuit of it can lead to addiction and dissatisfaction. The second level is life satisfaction, the cognitive judgment that one's life is going well, that one is achieving one's goals, that one is living according to one's values. This level is more stable than momentary pleasure, but it is still subject to adaptation and comparison. People judge their lives not against an absolute standard, but against the lives of others and against their own past expectations. As societies become richer, expectations rise, and the satisfaction that comes from meeting those expectations does not increase correspondingly. The third level is the biochemical baseline, the genetically determined set point around which happiness fluctuates. Research on twins suggests that approximately 50% of the variance in happiness is heritable. Some people are simply born with a predisposition to be happier than others, regardless of their life circumstances. This finding challenges the core assumption of modern politics and economics, that the goal of public policy should be to increase happiness by increasing wealth, health, and freedom. If happiness is largely determined by biology, then the most effective way to increase human happiness might be to manipulate human biochemistry directly, not to rearrange social and economic conditions. The chapter then explores the historical evidence for changes in happiness over time. Harari acknowledges that this evidence is fragmentary and difficult to interpret. We cannot survey people who lived thousands of years ago. We cannot measure their subjective well-being. We can only infer from indirect evidence, from rates of suicide, from artistic expression, from legal and religious texts, from the testimony of travelers and chroniclers. This evidence suggests that the agricultural revolution, far from increasing happiness, likely decreased it. The transition from foraging to farming brought longer work hours, poorer nutrition, higher rates of infectious disease, and greater social inequality. The first farmers were probably less happy than the last foragers. The rise of empires and civilizations brought peace and order to some, but conquest and exploitation to many. The lives of slaves, of peasants, of conquered peoples were likely not happy by any standard. The Industrial Revolution brought material abundance, but also environmental degradation, social dislocation, and the psychological pressures of urban life. There is no clear trend of increasing happiness over the long arc of history. There is only the ebb and flow of human experience, shaped by circumstances that are not always improving. Harari then turns to the question of whether modern science can solve the problem of happiness. He notes that researchers have made significant progress in understanding the neurochemistry of pleasure and satisfaction. Drugs can induce feelings of euphoria, of contentment, of well-being. Brain stimulation can produce intense pleasure. Genetic engineering could potentially raise the biochemical baseline of happiness for entire populations. The prospect of engineering happiness raises profound ethical questions. If happiness can be produced artificially, is it still meaningful? If we can make people feel happy regardless of their circumstances, does it matter what those circumstances are? If we can eliminate suffering through pharmacology, do we lose the motivation to create a more just and sustainable world? Harari does not answer these questions. He poses them as challenges to the reader. The pursuit of happiness has been a central theme of human history, but the tools for achieving it are changing. We may be on the verge of being able to create happiness directly, without the need for social transformation. Whether this is a liberation or a new form of enslavement is not yet clear. The chapter then explores the relationship between happiness and meaning. Harari argues that much of human happiness comes not from pleasure or satisfaction, but from a sense of meaning, from the feeling that one's life has purpose, that one is part of something larger than oneself. In traditional societies, meaning was provided by religion, by community, by the rhythms of nature. In modern societies, these sources of meaning have eroded. Many people report a sense of emptiness, of disconnection, of existential anxiety. The pursuit of happiness through consumption and entertainment has not filled this void. The permanent revolution has given us unprecedented freedom and material abundance. It has also taken away the stories that gave life meaning. The challenge of the 21st century is not just to create happiness, but to create meaning. And meaning, Harari suggests, is not something that can be manufactured in a laboratory. It is something that must be lived, chosen, created. The arrow of history is still in flight. We are still the archers. What we aim at and what we hit will determine not just our happiness, but our sense of whether happiness is worth having. The chapter closes with a reflection on the possibility that the entire quest for happiness is misguided. Harari notes that some philosophical and religious traditions, particularly Buddhism, argue that the pursuit of happiness is itself the source of suffering. The desire for pleasure, for satisfaction, for meaning, creates a sense of lack, a sense of incompleteness, a sense of dissatisfaction. The solution, according to these traditions, is not to satisfy desires, but to eliminate them. The goal is not happiness, but equanimity, the peaceful acceptance of whatever arises, free from craving and aversion. This perspective challenges the core assumptions of modern liberalism, which sees the pursuit of happiness as a fundamental right. It also challenges the findings of positive psychology, which seeks to identify the conditions that produce happiness. If the problem is desire itself, then the solution is not to rearrange the world to satisfy desire, but to transform the mind to be free of desire. Harari does not endorse this view. He presents it as an alternative, a possibility, a challenge to the reader. The story of Sapiens has been a story of increasing power, but not of increasing wisdom. We have learned how to do many things. We have not learned how to be happy. The arrow of history points toward greater power. It does not point toward greater contentment. Whether we can learn to be happy, or whether we will continue to chase a phantom, is the great question of our time. The chapter ends with Harari's observation that, "And they lived happily ever after," is a fairy tale ending. Real history does not have such endings. Real history is messy, ambiguous, and unresolved. We are living in the middle of the story, not at its end. The question of whether we will be happy is not a question that history can answer. It is a question that each of us must answer for ourselves in our own lives, with the tools and circumstances that we have. The arrow is still in flight. We are still the archers. What we aim at and what we hit will determine not just the future of our species, but the quality of our own brief, precious lives. The story is not over. It is just beginning. And how it ends, and whether anyone lives happily ever after, is up to us. The chapter closes there, not with an answer, but with an invitation. We have the power to shape the world. We have the power to shape ourselves. Whether we will use that power wisely, and whether we will find happiness in the process, is the question of our age. Let us answer it well. The story is ours to write. The happiness is ours to find. The arrow is in our hands. Let us aim with courage and with love. The future is waiting, and we are the ones who will create it. Chapter 20, The End of Homo Sapiens, serves as the final major chapter of the book before the afterword, and it confronts the most provocative question of all. What happens when the species that has reshaped the planet begins to reshape itself? Harari opens by observing that for all the revolutions that have transformed human society, from the cognitive revolution to the agricultural revolution to the scientific revolution, the basic biology of Homo sapiens has remained unchanged. A human being from 10,000 years ago could, in principle, be raised in modern society and function normally. Their brain, their body, their emotions, their cognitive capacities would be the same as ours. This is no longer guaranteed to be true for the future. The same technologies that have given us unprecedented power over the external world, biotechnology, artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, nanotechnology, are now giving us unprecedented power over our own biology. We are on the verge of being able to design and create new forms of life, including new forms of human life. The end of Homo sapiens, Harari argues, is not a prediction of extinction. It is a prediction of transformation. We will not be wiped out by a plague or a meteor. We will be replaced by something else, something of our own making. Harari then examines the three major pathways by which Homo sapiens might be superseded. The first is biotechnology, the direct manipulation of the human body and brain. Genetic engineering can already edit the DNA of embryos, potentially eliminating inherited diseases and enhancing desired traits. The CRISPR technology, which allows precise editing of genes, is rapidly advancing and becoming cheaper and more accessible. In the coming decades, it may become possible to design babies with enhanced intelligence, physical strength, disease resistance, and even personality traits. The line between therapy and enhancement is blurry, and once enhancement becomes possible, the pressure to use it will be immense. Parents who can afford to give their children a cognitive advantage will do so, creating a genetic divide between the enhanced and the unenhanced. Over generations, the enhanced may evolve into a separate species, no longer capable of interbreeding with the unenhanced. The end of Homo sapiens would not come as a catastrophe. It would come as a series of choices, each seemingly reasonable, each incrementally altering what it means to be human. The second pathway is the creation of cyborgs, the integration of organic bodies with non-organic components, prosthetics, cochlear implants, pacemakers, and deep brain stimulation devices already blur the line between human and machine. Brain-computer interfaces are being developed that would allow direct communication between the human brain and external devices, enabling control of computers, prosthetics, and even other machines through thought alone. As these interfaces become more sophisticated, they may allow the upload and download of memories, the augmentation of cognitive capacities, and the integration of human consciousness with artificial intelligence. A cyborg, part organic, part machine, would have capabilities far beyond those of a natural human. It might also have different desires, different values, different ways of experiencing the world. The cyborg would not be Homo sapiens. It would be something new, and it would likely outcompete its unmodified ancestors. The third pathway is the creation of completely non-organic artificial intelligence. Harari distinguishes between two types of artificial intelligence. The first is narrow AI, which can perform specific tasks better than humans, but lacks general intelligence. This already exists in search engines, in recommendation algorithms, in self-driving cars, in medical diagnostic systems. The second is general AI, which would be as capable as a human in any cognitive domain, and likely far more capable in most. The development of general AI is not a matter of if, but when. Most researchers in the field believe it will be achieved within this century. Once general AI exists, it will not remain at human level for long. It will rapidly improve itself, leading to an intelligence explosion, a singularity, beyond which we cannot predict. An artificial superintelligence would be the most powerful entity in history, capable of solving problems that are beyond human comprehension, but also potentially indifferent to human values. The alignment problem, the challenge of ensuring that a superintelligent AI pursues goals that are compatible with human flourishing, is unsolved and may be unsolvable. The end of Homo sapiens, in this scenario, would not be a transformation, but an obsolescence. We would be replaced by our own creations, not as slaves or victims, but as irrelevant bystanders. The chapter then explores the ethical and philosophical implications of these possibilities. Harari argues that the traditional frameworks of humanism, liberalism, and democracy are not equipped to handle the challenges of biotechnology, cyborgization, and artificial intelligence. These frameworks are built on the assumption of a stable human nature, of universal human rights, of the inherent dignity and equality of all human beings. But if humans can be designed, enhanced, and replaced, then these assumptions lose their foundation. The very concept of human rights becomes incoherent. If some humans are genetically enhanced and others are not, do they have the same rights? If a cyborg has cognitive capacities far beyond those of a natural human, is it entitled to equal political representation? If an artificial intelligence is more intelligent, more creative, and more capable of suffering than any human, does it deserve moral consideration? These questions are not abstract philosophical puzzles. They are practical questions that will be forced upon us by the pace of technological change. We are not prepared for them. Our legal systems, our political institutions, our ethical traditions were developed in a world where human nature was fixed. That world is ending. The world that is coming will require new ways of thinking, new forms of governance, new conceptions of value. Harari then addresses the question of whether we should try to stop or slow down these technologies. He acknowledges that there are strong arguments for restraint. The risks are enormous. A biotechnology arms race could lead to the creation of biological weapons that are easier to manufacture and more devastating than nuclear bombs. A race to develop general AI could lead to the creation of an entity that no one can control. The inequalities that already exist in the world could be magnified to grotesque proportions, with the rich enhancing themselves and their children into a new species, while the poor are left behind as an underclass. But Harari is not optimistic that restraint is possible. The same competitive dynamics that drove the spread of agriculture, the rise of empires, and the acceleration of the Industrial Revolution are still at work. If one country or one company pursues these technologies, others will feel compelled to follow, lest they be left behind. The logic of the security dilemma, the tragedy of the commons, and the prisoner's dilemma all suggest that restraint is unlikely. We may be hurtling toward an outcome that no one wants, but that no one can prevent. The end of Homo sapiens, in this reading, is not a choice. It is a fate. The chapter closes with a reflection on the meaning of this transformation. Harari argues that the end of Homo sapiens would not be the end of consciousness or of life. It would be the end of a particular form of life, the form that has dominated the planet for the past 70,000 years. What comes next could be wonderful or terrible, or both. It could be a world of enhanced humans, cyborgs, and artificial intelligences, cooperating to solve the great problems of disease, poverty, and environmental degradation. It could be a world of unimaginable suffering, of new forms of exploitation, of meaninglessness and despair. It could be something we cannot even imagine. The arrow of history does not point toward a predetermined goal. It points toward the unknown. The only thing we can be certain of is that the future will be different from the past, and that the changes will come faster than any previous generation has experienced. The end of Homo sapiens is not a distant prospect. It is already underway. We are living through it. The chapter ends with Harari's observation that the most important question of the 21st century is not how to produce more wealth, how to win more wars, how to cure more diseases. The most important question is, what do we want to become? This is not a scientific question. It is not a technological question. It is a moral and political question, and it is one that we are not used to asking. We have spent millennia asking how we can reshape the world. We have not spent enough time asking how we should reshape ourselves. The arrow is still in flight. We are still the archers. But the target is no longer out there. The target is us. What we aim at and what we hit will determine the future of life on Earth. The story of Sapiens is not over. It is entering its most fateful chapter. What we write in that chapter is up to us. The chapter closes there, not with an answer, but with a call. We have the power to end Homo sapiens. We also have the power to create something new. The question is not whether we will use that power. The question is, how? The arrow is in our hands. The target is ourselves. Let us aim with wisdom, with courage, and with love. The future is waiting, and we are the ones who will create it. The story is not over. It is just beginning, and the end is not written. It is ours to write. Let us write well. The afterword of Sapiens, titled The Animal That Became a God, serves as a concluding reflection on the entire journey of the book, drawing together its major themes and posing a final urgent question to the reader. Harari opens by revisiting the central paradox of the human story. Homo sapiens, an unremarkable African ape with no significant physical advantages, has become the most powerful force in the history of life on Earth. We have reshaped the planet, altered the climate, driven countless species to extinction, and developed technologies that could end all complex life in an instant. We have walked on the moon, sequenced our own genome, and created artificial intelligences that outperform us in tasks that once defined our uniqueness. In short, we have become gods, but we have done so without becoming wise. The same cognitive abilities that allowed us to cooperate in vast numbers, to invent money and nations and laws, to develop science and technology, have also enabled us to create suffering on an unprecedented scale. We are the most powerful species in history. We are also, arguably, the most destructive and the most miserable. The animal that became a god is still an animal, driven by desires and fears that evolved on the African savanna, not by the wisdom that our power demands. Harari then reviews the major revolutions of human history through this lens. The cognitive revolution gave us the ability to believe in fictions, to cooperate flexibly, and to adapt to new environments faster than natural selection could keep up. This made us the masters of the planet, but it also made us capable of believing in genocidal ideologies, in imperial ambitions, in the inherent superiority of one group over another. The agricultural revolution gave us surplus food, cities, and civilizations, but it also gave us hierarchy, exploitation, and epidemic disease. The foragers who lived in small, egalitarian bands may have been poor, but they were free. The farmers who built the pyramids, the peasants who toiled in the fields of the pharaohs, were richer in material terms, but they were also enslaved, taxed, conscripted, and controlled. The scientific revolution gave us unprecedented power over nature, but it also gave us nuclear weapons, environmental destruction, and the tools to manipulate life itself. At each stage, our power increased, but our wisdom did not keep pace. We are like a child who has been given a loaded gun, fascinated by its power, unaware of its danger, incapable of understanding the consequences of pulling the trigger. The afterword then turns to the question of what it would mean to become wise. Harari suggests that wisdom is not the same as intelligence. Intelligence is the ability to solve problems, to achieve goals, to manipulate the environment. Wisdom is the ability to choose the right goals, to distinguish between problems worth solving and problems that should be left alone, to recognize the limits of one's own knowledge and power. The history of Sapiens is a history of increasing intelligence. It is not a history of increasing wisdom. The same scientific methods that have cured diseases have also created weapons of mass destruction. The same economic systems that have lifted billions out of poverty have also destabilized the climate. The same political ideologies that have liberated oppressed peoples have also justified genocide. We have learned how to do many things. We have not learned how to choose which things to do. The animal that became a god is still learning to be a god, and the learning curve is steep. Harari then examines the particular challenges of the 21st century. The technologies of biotechnology, artificial intelligence, and nanotechnology are not just more powerful versions of previous technologies. They are qualitatively different because they give us the power to redesign ourselves. For the first time in history, the target of our transformative power is not the external world, but our internal biology. We can edit our genes, enhance our brains, integrate our bodies with machines, create artificial minds that may surpass us in every domain. This power is unprecedented, and it comes with unprecedented risks. The same technologies that could cure Alzheimer's, eliminate genetic diseases, and extend healthy lifespans could also create new forms of inequality, new forms of control, new forms of suffering. The animal that became a god now faces the prospect of becoming something else entirely, a being of our own design. Whether this prospect is terrifying or exhilarating depends on our confidence in our own wisdom. And that confidence, Harari suggests, should be low. The afterword also addresses the question of meaning. For most of human history, meaning was provided by stories, by religions, by traditions, by imagined orders that gave purpose and circuit value to individual lives. The scientific revolution has undermined these stories, exposing them as fictions, but it has not replaced them with anything equally compelling. Science can tell us how to cure a disease, how to build a bomb, how to manipulate a gene. It cannot tell us whether we should cure that disease, build that bomb, or manipulate that gene. It cannot tell us what is good, what is just, what is meaningful. The animal that became a god has lost its gods and has not yet found a replacement. We are left with our own values, our own choices, our own responsibility. This is a heavy burden, and it is not clear that we are capable of bearing it. The history of the 20th century, with its ideologies and atrocities, is a testament to the dangers of trying to create meaning without the guidance of tradition. The 21st century may be even more dangerous. The afterword closes with a final reflection on the future. Harari does not offer predictions. He does not offer solutions. He offers a question. What do we want to become? This question is not scientific. It is not technological. It is moral and political. It requires us to think about values, about priorities, about the kind of world we want to live in, and the kind of beings we want to be. The answer is not obvious. The answer may not even exist. But the question cannot be avoided. The technologies that are transforming our world are not going away. The choices that we make individually and collectively will shape the future of life on Earth. The animal that became a god has the power to destroy itself and the planet. It also has the power to create something new, something better, something worthy of the intelligence that we have been given. The arrow of history is still in flight. We are still the archers. The target is ourselves. What we aim at and what we hit will determine whether the story of Sapiens is a tragedy, a comedy, or something that neither word can capture. The afterword ends with Harari's final observation. We are not the culmination of history. We are not its final product. We are just another chapter, another turn of the screw, another step on a path that stretches into an unknown future. The animal that became a god is still becoming. What it will become is not yet written. The story is not over. It is just beginning, and the end, whatever it is, will be written by us, with the choices we make, the values we hold, and the wisdom we do or do not acquire. The book closes there, not with a conclusion, but with a call. We have the power of gods. Let us learn to use it well. The arrow is in our hands. The target is the future. Let us aim with courage, with humility, and with love. The story of Sapiens is our story. How it ends is up to us.